I'm a tycoon in World War I, starting by saving France. Hey, fanfic family. So glad to see you here again to continue this incredible adventure. As always, kindly remember, this story is 100% fiction. So don't go looking for dimensional portals in your closet. All rights to this fantastic novel belong to the original author. We're just your humble narrators of epic tales. Are you enjoying the fanfic? Show it by subscribing to our YouTube channel and dropping us a like. And if you're impatient for more exclusive content, our Patreon is your happy place. Chapter 776 The End of Falconham. Lieutenant Colonel Durer's second bureau was not dispensable to Charles. While the White Lady was secretive and numerous, their weakness lay in the fact that the vast majority of its members came from the civilian population, specifically from the lower and middle classes. They found it extremely difficult to obtain government, official, or upper-level secrets. These things, however, were easy for the Second Bureau. Therefore, the two could complement each other, one in the open, the other in the shadows, one at the top, the other among the people. On the other hand, Charles did this to sideline Clemenceau. If Clemenceau became Prime Minister, he would be the Second Bureau's direct superior. If the Second Bureau was under his control, it would have leverage to negotiate with Charles, even challenge him. But if the Second Bureau accepted Charles's command, Clemenceau would lose his last support and be forced to follow Charles's lead. Charles was generous. From now on, I will be responsible for the Second Bureau's funding and equipment. You will report directly to me, understand? Yes, General, Lieutenant Colonel Durer readily agreed. Charles is a moneymaker. The Second Bureau will definitely be much more financially secure than before, and not just a little. Charles then asked, you know how to handle Brian's matter, right? Of course, General, Lieutenant Colonel Durer replied, standing up as he did so. I'll take care of it right away. Half an hour later, Lieutenant Colonel Durer appeared in the Prime Minister's office at the Paris City Hall. Brian, still shaken by the constant harassment from citizens, breathed a sigh of relief upon seeing Lieutenant Colonel Durer and the two guards behind him. Thank you for coming, Lieutenant Colonel. I desperately need manpower, is that so? Lieutenant Colonel Durer glanced expressionlessly at the messy office, increasingly convinced that his choice was right. His gaze locked onto Brian, and he said coldly, you've been arrested, Prime Minister. I think you know why. Brian was taken aback, then suddenly shouted angrily, no, you can't do this. You have no right to do this. I'm still the Prime Minister, understand? As long as I'm the Prime Minister, you must obey my orders, not arrest me. Lieutenant Colonel Durer interrupted Brian. You're right, except for treason, Prime Minister. The Prime Minister's treason meant the Second Bureau could no longer accept his orders. With that, Lieutenant Colonel Durer waved his hand, and two guards immediately seized Brian. 2 days later, the matter was settled. Considering the country's need for a Prime Minister, Parliament quickly accepted Brian's resignation and elected a new Prime Minister. Clemenceau walked onto the podium at the Bourbon Palace amidst cheers and delivered his speech. Charles did not attend. As the behind-the-scenes boss, he wanted to distance himself from these matters as much as possible. On the surface, he was just a general, obeying the orders of the Parliament and the government, a general who only considered how to defeat the enemy. He arranged to meet Lucia at Parco's. Lucia actually hoped to go shopping or see a movie with Charles. These are things normal couples do, Lucia said. Are you sure? Charles countered. Then Lucia understood, Charles couldn't go shopping or see a movie like a normal person. Once he stepped onto the street without guards to maintain order, he would immediately be surrounded by thousands of citizens. Seeing a movie was an unrealistic fantasy. It could even cause a stampede and deaths. After all, movie theaters are enclosed spaces and crowded places. So Lucia stopped making such requests and could only choose the secluded Parcos. Good news and bad news, Lucia said leisurely, sitting on the green lawn, gazing at the Seine below. With the arrival of summer, many small boats carrying seasonal fruits appeared on the river. From this time of year until winter, it was the busiest time for fruit farmers. Is there any good news? I don't know. Charles sat down next to Lucia, the lawn a bit prickly from lack of mowing. Your old rival has been relieved of his command, Lucia said. Old rival, Charles said, you mean Brian? Did she really need to tell me that? Lucia laughed, turning to Charles with a mocking tone. It's not your fault, General, it's my fault. You have too many rivals. Then she gave the answer, it's Falkenhayn, the German chief of the general staff. To be precise, not relieved of his command, but transferred to command the Ninth Army. directing the war against Romania, Charles said oh, and then asked, for what reason? The words were barely out of his mouth when Charles realized how foolish he had been. Falkenhayn had been suffering defeats on the Western Front. It was already quite remarkable that he had only been relieved of his command now. However, Lucia gave a different answer. It's not because of the war, but because he changed the original West First, East Second strategic direction and instead supported East First, West Second. Wilhelm I had always insisted on West First, East Second, and he had once argued with Falkenhayn and the General Staff. We cannot win on the Western Front, Your Majesty, Falkenhayn said, because of Charles on the Western Front. We can only consider winning on the Eastern Front first, and then dealing with Charles with all our might. I know, Wilhelm I replied, but do you know what this means? Charles has already reached Metz, and he only needs one more step to enter Germany. If we transfer our forces to the Eastern Front, do you know what will happen? Falkenhayn spread out a map and analyzed for Wilhelm I. We can consolidate our defensive lines and deploy our forces on the border. For some reason, I believe Charles will postpone his attack. For some reason, Wilhelm I looked at Falkenhayn in confusion. Charles wouldn't want this war to end so quickly, Falkenhayn said. He's only just achieved political victory, his position isn't secure, and the capitalists are still targeting him. If he loses external threats, his rivals might come back. That's absurd. Wilhelm I dismissed Falkenhayn's idea without hesitation. Unbelievable. You're pinning your hopes on the enemy, hoping Charles won't attack? That's impossible, as long as we don't make a move, Falkenhayn replied confidently. I don't think Charles will be willing to put too much pressure on us right now. The two disagreed on this point. Wilhelm I believed that a tacit understanding could be reached with Charles on the naval front, but there was a fundamental conflict of interest on the army. If the German army had invaded France, why should he believe the French army wouldn't invade Germany? The debate resulted in Falkenhayn's dismissal and Hindenburg's appointment as chief of the General Staff. Wilhelm I failed to realize one thing. Falkenhayn was his staunchest ally, and Falkenhayn's loss of power almost meant the loss of his own authority as the Kaiser. In the near future, Germany will fall into the hands of Hindenburg and Ludendorff, both military dictators. With a military in control on both sides, what kind of clashes will occur? Chapter 777 Freemasonry. There's only one chapter tonight, I'll make up for it tomorrow. What's the bad news? Charles asked. He didn't think there could be any bad news right now. Lucia didn't answer directly, but asked with a serious expression, have you heard of the Freemasons? Charles hummed an agreement. It was a united organization that originated in England and later spread throughout Europe and America. Its members were all powerful capitalists, high-ranking politicians, or social celebrities. Lucia said, you've successfully caught the organization's attention. I guess they might be assessing the possibility of recruiting you. Then she turned to Charles, you won't join, will you? Charles hummed an agreement. Charles had already established his own independent system, and joining would only tie his own hands. Although Charles was also a capitalist, his existence threatened the capitalist system itself. He had created another capitalist system that was in competition with the original system, and they could not be integrated. So, Lucia cast his gaze toward the Darvaz factory district. This isn't the end, it's the beginning. The Freemasons are not like ordinary capitalists, and their intelligence network is far more sophisticated than the Second Bureau. Charles nodded slightly, indicating he understood. It was an organization targeting nations, often unleashing a global financial storm when they acted. Their methods were not complex, using their accumulated wealth and power to manipulate a nation's currency, controlling its assets, and then cashing out at a high price, leaving the mess for the government and people. This is what is commonly known as fleecing. To avoid being put on the defensive, one option was to nationalize industries vital to the nation's survival, such as energy, military, agriculture, steel, transportation, communications, and electricity. Otherwise, the nation's very existence would be in their hands. How could they possibly fight back? But this was almost impossible. The Third French Republic had virtually no basis for nationalization, advocating a market economy. Another option was to develop themselves to a point where they were powerful enough that the Bernard Group and its partner companies alone could regulate the national market and maintain price stability. Charles chose the latter, but it was not easy. Before this, Charles thought the Bernard Group had developed fast enough and had sufficient resources. Now, he suddenly realized he was far from adequate, even feeling a sense of crisis. This was because Charles's focus had been on energy and the military industry, neglecting other areas. In the afternoon, sunlight filtered through the thin mist, casting lingering shadows in the Prime Minister's office. Clemenceau smugly spun around in the rocking chair in front of his office, then raised his glass of red wine, tossed it lightly at the office furnishings, and downed it in one gulp. Finally back in this position, he sighed as he put down his glass. He leisurely lit a cigar, exhaled deeply amidst the swirling smoke. If there was any drawback, it was Charles's control. But what did it matter? Clemenceau thought. Charles also provided him with protection sufficient to ensure his peace of mind, something other capitalists couldn't offer. Thinking this, Clemenceau felt relieved. If he had several options, he would still choose to cooperate with Charles. Charles was a very reliable force. Just then, two soft sounds came from outside the door, and the secretary pushed it open to report, "Your Excellency, General Charles has arrived. He wants to discuss the Battle of Metz with you." "Oh, of course." Clemenceau quickly put down his cigar. "Let him in." Clemenceau waited a moment, and when Charles opened the door, he immediately stood up and hurried to greet him. "Welcome, General. I was just about to speak with you. I didn't expect you to come. This way, please. Would you like a drink?" For our victory today, Clemenceau emphasized he didn't want to offend this behind-the-scenes boss. "No, thank you." Charles walked to the sofa and sat down by himself. "A cup of coffee, please." "Of course." Clemenceau gestured to the secretary. 2 cups of coffee. After the coffee was served, Charles didn't touch it. He was worried about one thing. "Your Excellency the Prime Minister," Charles said, "I would like to know if there is any large-scale acquisition of farmland and building land in France." "Yes," Clemenceau nodded. "This happened shortly after the outbreak of war. As you know, during wartime, a large amount of labor was sent to the battlefield. Even the elderly and women went to factories to produce ammunition and equipment. This resulted in vast amounts of farmland being left uncultivated, farmers and ranchers going bankrupt, and farmland prices plummeting. The situation with building land is similar. During wartime, no one could afford to build houses, and because many soldiers died in battle, a large number of second-hand homes were available for sale, causing both land and housing prices to plummet." Charles's heart sank. It was exactly as he had expected. Charles had always considered military and profit-making. His strategy focused on the company. Now, having gained most of control over France and considering things from the perspective of the nation, he suddenly realized that the initiative had always been in the hands of the Freemason capitalists. Farmland represents a nation's agriculture. It relates to the most important of a nation's basic needs: food, clothing, shelter, and transportation. It's true that we can import goods from the United States now. But in peacetime, large capitalists who control vast tracts of farmland can manipulate grain prices at will, exploiting French citizens in various ways, while the government in Charles can only watch helplessly. This even concerns national security. If the country is surrounded by enemies on the outside, and the farmland is controlled by capitalists, survival will depend on the capitalists' benevolence. Construction land is a matter of housing. Driving it up in price and then cashing out can easily cripple a country's economy. Charles was somewhat frustrated. Another reason he hadn't considered this was his past experience living in a country with public ownership of the means of production, a habit that led him to overlook this point. Now, Charles was conquering territory on the front lines, while capitalists were harvesting valuable assets at low prices on the back. No, Charles thought, these capitalists must be made to relinquish this land. How? After a moment's consideration, Charles said to Clemenceau, "Your Excellency, after several consecutive battles, the French army has suffered heavy casualties. The British Expeditionary Force, on the other hand, should have recovered considerably after a period of rest. I believe we should entrust the defense of the area east of the Meuse River to the British Expeditionary Force." "What do you think?" Clemenceau agreed without hesitation. "Of course. They are our allies and should contribute on the battlefield, not just rest and watch from the rear." He then added sarcastically, "These Englishmen, they can't even march as fast as we can reclaim our land. They're just wasting resources and food." Chapter 778 Marshal Hindenburg. Berlin's Forgotten Palace. Mid-May is the time when grape blossoms are in full bloom, their flowers swaying gracefully on the vines, their delicate fragrance filing the dappled sunlight, bringing a sense of joy. However, they cannot dispel the shadows in Wilhelm II's heart. Wilhelm II strolled through the vineyards, intending to clear his mind, but the surrounding flowers only caught his eye, not his attention. Wilhelm II's mind was filled with Hindenburg's situation. He regretted dismissing Buckingham and transferring him to command the Ninth Army. Before doing so, Wilhelm II hadn't considered one crucial question: who would be chief of the general staff? Who was still qualified for the position? Wilhelm II had assumed it was simple: remove Buckingham and replace him with another general. However, Hindenburg was invincible on the Eastern Front. If Charles was the Mars of France, then Hindenburg was the Ares of Germany. The image above is of Ares. Mars is the Roman god of war, while Ares is the Greek god of war, although Wilhelm II believed this was partly due to luck. If Buckingham and Hindenburg had been switched, Buckingham leading the Eastern Front against Russia and Hindenburg facing the Charles on the Western Front, Buckingham, not Hindenburg, would now be known as the German Ares. But facts are facts, and war has no what-ifs. The only defeat on the Eastern Front was also unrelated to Hindenburg. The Russian Brusilov offensive broke through the Austro-Hungarian defenses. At this time, Austria-Hungary was still an independent army, unwilling to obey Hindenburg's command and insisting on independent operations. Reality, however, dealt Austria-Hungary a severe blow. Austria-Hungary's defeat, in a way, proved Hindenburg's ideas to be correct and far-sighted. If Hindenburg hadn't sent reinforcements to stop Brusilov's army, Austria-Hungary might have collapsed. Under these circumstances, who else could have served as chief of the General Staff of Germany and commanded the entire army? Although Wilhelm II was extremely reluctant, the eyes of the entire nation were on Hindenburg. The entire army wanted Hindenburg to command them, and even the ministers believed that only Hindenburg could save Germany. What could Wilhelm II do? Force someone else to be appointed chief of the General Staff? He would likely be ousted amidst a chorus of condemnation within days. Bring Buckingham back? Even if Wilhelm II could swallow that pride, Buckingham wouldn't return, because he had suffered many defeats on the Western Front and was ousted due to his incompetence. Now, without any military achievements, he certainly couldn't return to command Hindenburg as chief of the General Staff. What a foolish move! Wilhelm II was filled with deep self-reproach. But by then, it was too late for regrets. He had no choice but to hand over command of the entire army to Hindenburg, whether on the Western or Eastern Front. The same applied to the Austro-Hungarian army. Wilhelm II heard that Hindenburg was pressuring Austria-Hungary to relinquish command. Hindenburg's reasoning was sound: only by truly uniting, under unified command, and through close intelligence sharing and coordination, can we possibly defeat the enemy completely. Consider the predicament faced by the Austro-Hungarian army, Italy, Romania, and the disastrous defeats on the Eastern Front under the Russian offensive. If we are unwilling to do so, the likely outcome is utter annihilation. The last sentence carried a strong sense of urgency. Everyone could hear the threat, including Emperor Franz Joseph I of Austria-Hungary. The image above shows the Austrian Empire and Emperor Franz Joseph I of Austria-Hungary. Wilhelm II knew that Joseph I would ultimately compromise. Austria-Hungary had no power to refuse. It was simultaneously beset on three fronts: Italy, Romania, and Russia. If Hindenburg withdrew and did not send reinforcements, Austria-Hungary faced the danger of annihilation. Whether to hand over command to Hindenburg or face annihilation, any sane person would make the right choice. Thus, Hindenburg would control all the troops, and he would immediately become the most powerful person in Germany. Your Majesty, a guard reported, Field Marshal Hindenburg has arrived and is waiting for you in the drawing room. Wilhelm II's heart skipped a beat, a flicker of displeasure crossing his eyes. Normally, if Wilhelm II was in the vineyard, Hindenburg, as a subject, wanted to see the emperor, he should have come to the vineyard. Now, Hindenburg was waiting for Wilhelm II in the drawing room, making it sound as if Wilhelm II was going to see him. But Wilhelm II dared not say anything. Very well, tell him to wait a moment. Yes, Your Majesty, the guard replied and withdrew. Wilhelm II didn't intend to return immediately. He wanted to put on airs and make Hindenburg wait, thus asserting his dignity. However, he immediately realized that he didn't seem to have the right to do so. Without Hindenburg's approval, Wilhelm II might not even be able to mobilize a single infantry company. After hesitating for a moment, Wilhelm II sighed and walked down the steps of the vineyard towards the drawing room. There were no guards at the drawing room entrance before, but now two men stood on either side of them, Hindenburg's men. They were unarmed, and when Wilhelm II approached, they stood at attention and saluted, yet they still exerted immense pressure on him. Hindenburg stood by the window, looking out at the scenery, pretending not to notice Wilhelm II's arrival. He stood tall with his arms crossed behind his back, as if waiting for a report from his subordinates. The image above shows Hindenburg in 1916. Only when Wilhelm II drew near did Hindenburg suddenly realize what was happening, turn around, and stand at attention to salute. "It is an honor to meet you, Your Majesty." Wilhelm II suppressed his displeasure and politely invited Hindenburg to sit on the sofa, then eagerly had coffee and fruit brought to him. "Is everything going well, Marshal?" Wilhelm II said. "I hope your workload is not too heavy. You'd better suggest focusing on only one front, so I can legitimately hand over the Western Front to someone else." Hindenburg, however, gave Wilhelm II no chance. He calmly replied, "You have absolutely no need to worry about that, Your Majesty. In fact, I think the work of the General Staff is much simpler than that of the Commander-in-Chief of the Eastern Front." "Oh, really?" Wilhelm II laughed, a bitter smile playing on his lips. "Of course." Hindenburg took a sip of his coffee. "Because when I was Commander-in-Chief of the Eastern Front, I always had to worry about my superiors transferring my troops. Now, that's no longer a concern." Wilhelm II's smile faltered. Previously, Wilhelm II and Buckingham had implemented a West first, East later policy, frequently transferring troops from the Eastern Front to fill gaps in the Western Front. Hindenburg's words, seemingly innocuous, were actually a boast to Wilhelm II. Chapter 779 Sitting on the mountain and watching the tigers fight. The conversation between Wilhelm II and Hindenburg ended in a seemingly harmonious atmosphere. This was Hindenburg's first conversation with Wilhelm II since being promoted to Chief of the General Staff, marking his formal inauguration and, arguably, a consensus reached on the strategic direction for the Western Front. "I know you insist on the East first, West later strategy, Field Marshal," Wilhelm II stated bluntly, "but I believe it was your consideration as Commander-in-Chief of the Eastern Front. Now, as Chief of the General Staff, we should consider the overall situation." "Yes, I agree." Hindenburg nodded slightly. "Really? That's excellent." Wilhelm II was somewhat excited. He pointed to the map and analyzed. "You know, the 1st Panzer Corps of the Charles is adept at infiltration warfare. If we focus our efforts on the Eastern Front and neglect the defense of the Western Front, the Charles Army will advance deep into Germany." Hindenburg nodded again. "Indeed," Wilhelm II continued, "then it won't just be a matter of holding the lines. The Charles will threaten the security of our homeland, especially the Ruhr industrial region. Once it falls to the Charles, we're finished. The defenses on other fronts will collapse like dominoes." The map above shows the location of the Ruhr industrial region in Germany, its most important industrial area, known as the heart of German industry. "You're absolutely right, Your Majesty." Hindenburg nodded again, then fell silent. Wilhelm II suddenly understood something. Hindenburg was just putting on an act. He had no interest in listening to what he had to say, and of course, he wouldn't agree with his views. But Wilhelm II could only continue the charade. "I'm glad we reached an agreement, Field Marshal. Knowing you think the same way puts me at ease. I believe you're capable of the work of Chief of the General Staff, and I firmly believe you will lead Germany to victory, just as you have done before." Hindenburg rose gracefully and bowed to Wilhelm II. "I will not disappoint your expectations, Your Majesty." With that, he left with his guards. The moment Hindenburg stepped out of the room, Wilhelm II slumped onto the sofa. He felt he was finished. Not long ago he had held immense power, but suddenly he found himself unable to control anything. No, perhaps there was still hope. The General Staff could only control the army. Hindenburg could not control the navy, nor did he understand it. Thinking this, Wilhelm II ordered his butler, "Send a telegram to Admiral Scheer, tell him to come immediately." "Yes, Your Majesty," the butler replied. That afternoon, Admiral Scheer sat on the sofa in Wilhelm II's living room. Wilhelm II was unusually enthusiastic towards Admiral Scheer, exchanging pleasantries before asking, "General, how is the Navy doing now?" "Everything is going well, Your Majesty," Admiral Scheer replied. "We have deployed 36 new seaplanes, equipped with torpedoes." "Excellent," Wilhelm II praised. "Then, prepare to break through the British blockade." Recently, Admiral Scheer was somewhat surprised. He had hoped to acquire more seaplanes before commencing operations. Otherwise, if the 36 bombers were lost and could not be replaced, it would affect subsequent plans. "Your Majesty," Admiral Scheer said, "once the war begins, we will need a continuous influx of troops. Any interruption could lead to another blockade. Naval warfare differs from land warfare. After winning a land battle, a detachment can be deployed to garrison a high ground or construct a defensive line. In naval warfare, there is nowhere to defend. Warships and aircraft must continuously patrol to prevent enemy warships from approaching, thus ensuring the safety of rear shipping lanes. I know, Wilhelm I replied, but you know the current situation. Supplies are scarce at the front, and we must restore trade with the neutral Nordic countries as soon as possible. Therefore, breaking the blockade is imperative, or you know what will happen. Admiral Skier nodded in agreement. Yes, Your Majesty, as you wish. In truth, Wilhelm I didn't reveal his real intentions. If the navy continued to be blockaded in ports as usual, she could not stand on equal footing with the army. But if she could break the blockade, it would not only increase the navy's prestige but also give her control over trade with the neutral Nordic countries. Note, during World War I, Sweden, Norway, and other Nordic countries remained neutral and did not participate in the war, but because the British Navy blockaded the shipping lanes, supplies could not be transported to Germany. If she could control these supplies through the navy, Wilhelm I thought, then she could indirectly control the army like Skier had. God, Wilhelm I exclaimed inwardly, if I just do as Skier did, one day power will be back in my hands. Berlin, Wilhelmstrasse General Staff Headquarters. Hindenburg sat at his desk, staring blankly at the map of the Western Front. His deputy, Ludendorff, approached him, glanced at the map, and cautiously asked, is this His Majesty's order? Wilhelm I must want to strengthen the defenses on the Western Front, Ludendorff thought. No, Hindenburg replied, his eyes fixed on the map. I'm considering Fuckingham's words. Fuckingham, a flicker of surprise crossed Ludendorff's eyes. He was dismissed for shifting his support to East first, West later, which proves our thinking is correct. Hindenburg shook his head again. Not that. After a pause, Hindenburg gave his answer. Fuckingham said that the Charles doesn't want to defeat us too soon. He needs to maintain an external threat so he can better deal with the capitalists targeting him domestically. Ludendorff laughed. Arrogant fellow. This is war. Both sides are doing everything they can to crush the other, yet he thinks that Charles is selectively targeting us. He really thinks that Charles is Mars. Hindenburg calmly interrupted Ludendorff. I think he's right. What? Ludendorff stared at Hindenburg in disbelief. Hindenburg handed Ludendorff a telegram. The British Expeditionary Force is moving towards Metz. Ludendorff took it, glanced at it, and nodded. Yes, I've seen the telegram. Don't you find it strange? Hindenburg looked up and asked. Charles has already occupied Metz, and moving further east would allow him to easily occupy the entire Lorraine region and Alsace. Why hasn't he done that? Instead, at this crucial final stage, he's handing over the defense zone to the British Expeditionary Force. Ludendorff hadn't thought much of it at first, assuming the British troops moving to Metz were reinforcements, not a rotation. Now, after Hindenburg's explanation, he also found it strange. He asked, half believing, could it be that Charles wants us to attack the British? Hindenburg nodded slightly. Yes. I think he wants to use the Meuse River as a boundary, placing the British Expeditionary Force under the line of fire of our attack. He paused, then added, or you could say, he's sitting back and watching the tigers fight. Chapter 780 Unable to agree. Charles did indeed have a wait-and-see mentality. He believed it was unfair to let the British win so easily. As allies, how could the French fight to the death while the British enjoyed the spoils in the rear? From the perspective of weakening British strength, it was also necessary to send the British Expeditionary Force to the front. The key point was that this was an open strategy, one that both Germany and Britain had no choice but to accept. In Germany, Hindenburg had just taken office and needed a victory to prove he was capable not only on the Eastern Front but also on the Western Front. Only in this way could he solidify his position and show everyone that he was competent for the position of Chief of the General Staff. At this crucial moment, Charles offered a victory with both hands. Hindenburg had no reason not to accept. In Britain, Kitchener's repeated defeats had made his position precarious, and Haig's disastrous defeat at the Somme had shattered the myth of his military genius. They desperately needed a chance to redeem themselves, otherwise, their political and military careers might be over. So, why not let them fight it out on the east bank of the Meuse? North of Dunkirk lies a place known as the most beautiful beach in the north. The soft sand is studded with many beautiful seashells. Although there's no azure sky or bright sunshine today, gentle waves constantly lap at the shore, leaving behind cotton-like foam. Kitchener and Haig walk side by side on the beach, seemingly trying to clear their minds, but the gentle sea breeze cannot smooth the sorrow from their brows. After walking for a while, Kitchener takes a newspaper from his pocket and hands it to Haig. "Take a look at this." Haig reluctantly takes the newspaper. Since being rescued by Charles at the Battle of the Somme, he's developed a habit of not reading newspapers, since they never seem to bring good news. But Kitchener makes him read, so he has no choice. This is from the Times, its front page featuring a scathing critique of Haig. Perhaps we shouldn't call Haig a military genius. He doesn't even qualify as one, because if Haig possesses military talent, then what is Charles? When the British Expeditionary Force was besieged at Dunkirk, Haig only criticized Charles for refusing to come to their aid, complaining that Charles ignored the interests of the alliance, and denouncing Charles as a cancer on the Allies. His performance seemed to suggest that everything was Charles's fault, that everything was Charles's doing. But what is the truth? While he was ranting like a woman at Dunkirk, Charles had already led his troops across the Ardennes and ultimately rescued the British Expeditionary Force from the German attack. Charles saved the lives of nearly 1 million British Expeditionary Force soldiers, including Haig. Is this how we repay our saviors? Is this what we should do as allies, as soldiers, as members of the Allies? Haig couldn't stand it anymore. He slammed his hands together, crumpled the newspaper into a ball, and threw it onto the beach. Easy for you to say. This isn't true. We've done everything we could. Charles used us as bait. Charles had planned everything in advance, but who cares? Kitchener interrupted Haig, his voice tinged with displeasure. Even if it were true, so what? Nobody would believe you. They'd see it as slander against Charles, as your resentment and jealousy, and as ingratitude. Haig's face turned pale with anger, but he was helpless. Think about reality, Douglas. Kitchener turned his gaze to the ocean, where flocks of seagulls cried out and soared overhead. However, to Kitchener, those cries sounded like mockery. After a moment of silence, Kitchener continued, his tone heavy. Do you know how dire our situation is? Members of Parliament have already proposed removing you from your post as commander of the Expeditionary Force. Some have even suggested handing command of the Expeditionary Force over to Charles. Haig was furious, his voice trembling with rage as he objected. Absurd. When has the army of our great British Empire fallen so low as to need a Frenchman to command it? Even if I agreed, my soldiers wouldn't, and the British citizens wouldn't agree either. It's a disgrace, even treason. Kitchener didn't speak, but turned and silently looked at Haig. Haig was stunned. They passed a proposal? No. Kitchener shook his head, but a considerable number of British citizens, even soldiers of the Expeditionary Force, support this proposal. No, that's impossible. Nothing is impossible. Kitchener interrupted Haig. Have you considered that this may be a disgrace, a lack of dignity, but what does it matter compared to life? Haig understood. Fighting alongside Charles meant survival and the glory of victory. Besides, as Allied forces, being under Charles's unified command couldn't be considered treason. Kitchener added, especially the colonial army. Haig's heart sank. Yes, the colonial army had long harbored this desire. The colonial army was different from the British soldiers. The British soldiers still had dignity, honor, and a sense of national pride, but the colonial army lacked these burdens. They were fighting alongside other armies anyway. Following the British was no different from following the French. But following Charles meant they wouldn't die. Kitchener continued walking forward, and Haig hurriedly followed from behind. Kitchener spoke slowly. We all know the Minister of Munitions is behind this. He wants to cripple the army, cripple everything we have, so the Royal Navy can gain the most. But if we do nothing and continue like this, there will only be one outcome for us. Understand? Haig nodded in reply. Yes, Your Excellency, but he immediately asked, but now there's nowhere for us to fight. Charles's forces occupy the entire offensive front. Don't worry about that, Kitchener said confidently. He will need us. The Meuse line requires a considerable force, and the Germans aren't so easy to deal with. What you need to consider is how to do your own job well. Yes, Your Excellency, Haig replied verbally, but inwardly he was unconvinced. Charles could recapture Lorraine and Alsace with the strength of the French army alone. He didn't need the British Expeditionary Force. At that moment, a communications soldier hurried up along the coast and handed Kitchener a telegram. Your Excellency Marshal, a telegram from the French Ministry of War. They request our reinforcements to Metz. Kitchener took the telegram and waved it at Haig. See? This is what I told you. Your chance has come. Haig was stunned. Charles had actually requested reinforcements. Kitchener sighed inwardly. He had only guessed that Charles would let the British fight the Germans. But even so, he had no choice but to agree. That was Charles's brilliance. Chapter 781 Land Acquirers. The citizens of Metz were in a frenzy of celebration. For 46 years, since the Franco-German War of 1870, Metz had been under German rule, and now it was finally back in France. People sang and danced, flowers were scattered throughout the streets, and cheers greeted the French troops entering the city. But in the town hall of Chamber, Charles was discussing the rotation of troops with Tigny. Note, Metz consists of 3 islands surrounded by rivers, Grand Saule, Petit Saule, and Chamber. Tigny didn't understand Charles's actions, not at all. He said excitedly, "We are only one step away from recapturing the entire territory, General. Victory awaits us. The Germans are unprepared, while we have an armored corps and 2 motorized divisions, and the armies of Foch and Pétain behind us. Why don't we attack Alsace and end this?" Charles countered, "And then? Will the war end?" Tigny was stunned. Even if the entire territory were recaptured, the war wouldn't end, because Germany hadn't surrendered. What the capitalists wanted was Germany's unconditional surrender. Only then could they obtain huge reparations and possibly pay for Britain's massive loans. "We need to consider the bigger picture, Major General," Charles said. "Including political factors." Political? Tigny looked confused. Does winning the war have a political downside? Charles couldn't answer that it was to maintain an external threat. But he had plenty of excuses. Tigny was only concerned with the art of war, completely ignorant of politics. "Of course," Charles nodded. "Our soldiers have been fighting continuously for months. They need rest, and they're quite resentful of the British doing nothing. You don't want another mutiny, do you?" Tigny nodded slowly. In the long run, that was indeed the case. After Lorraine, there was Alsace. After Alsace, there was Germany. Was it always going to be the French army charging at the front while the British did nothing in the rear? "All right," Tigny conceded. "You're right," but then he asked, "But what about Maze? You keep emphasizing how important she is. The British might lose her, and then all our efforts will be wasted, while the Germans will specifically strengthen her defenses. Then it will cost us even more to take her back." Charles smiled slightly. "Don't worry about that. We can dismantle some of the defenses here, such as some of the fortresses we consider threatening." Tigny looked at Charles in surprise. "But that would cause problems for the British defenses." He stopped mid-sentence, then shrugged. "Why not? The British having problems with their defenses was their problem. What did it have to do with the French?" Charles added, "Those fortresses were destroyed in the war." "Of course." Tigny nodded heavily. "To be precise, they were half destroyed in the war and could collapse at any moment. We had no choice but to demolish them." Charles nodded in satisfaction. No one was better at making excuses than Tigny, this rich second generation. "These matters are yours to handle," Charles said, tossing out a sentence. "After the rotation, retreat to the west bank of the Meuse." "I'm going to Paris." "Yes, General," Tigny replied, stepping forward. "Armand Estate, Paris." When not in use, Armand mostly lay in bed, even when the sun was high in the sky. Of course, his bed was never alone. After Grevy was sent to the guillotine, feeling like he had just escaped death, Armand had a large bed custom-made for himself, a bed that could accommodate 5 or 6 people at the same time. He believed in enjoying life while he could, otherwise, when it was his turn to go to the guillotine, he would surely regret his wasted life. Just as he was enjoying himself in bed, a few soft knocks came at the door, and the butler's trembling voice came, "Sir, I think you should get out." Armand grabbed an empty wine glass from the bedside table and smashed it. The butler was terrified by the sound of shattering glass and dared not utter a sound for a long time. But finally, he mustered his courage. "Sir, it's General Charles. He wishes to speak with you." "No one. Get him out of here." His voice was tinged with sleep and drunkenness. But the next second, he suddenly awoke, jerking his head from the throng of central figures. "What? Who did you say?" The butler replied, "It's General Charles, sir. He's waiting for you in the living room." Armand jumped out of bed as if pricked by a needle, frantically dressing while shouting, "Wait a moment, I'll be right there. Get the general a cup of coffee." "Yes, sir." In the lavishly decorated living room, Charles had just taken a sip of his coffee when Armand rushed in, his clothes disheveled, his long hair tangled like weeds. Despite this, he still managed to maintain his elegance, bowing respectfully to Charles. "It's an honor to meet you, General." Charles's appearance surprised Armand. Given Charles's status, it wasn't appropriate for him to be associated with the right-wing royalists. It would lead people to mistakenly believe that Charles intended to overthrow the Republic and become emperor. But Armand realized the next second that Charles no longer needed to worry about this. He controlled the army, the Second Inquisition, public opinion, and even held a majority in Parliament. Who would dare challenge Charles? Armand tried to relax, went to the wine cabinet to pour himself a glass of red wine, and politely turned to Charles, asking, "Would you like a glass, General?" "No." Charles gestured with his chin towards the coffee on the table. "I'll have this instead." Armand sat down opposite Charles with his wine, raising his glass. "I should congratulate you, General. You have successfully defeated your opponent in less than 2 years, a miracle." This was a heartfelt compliment. No one could have done it, not even Napoleon. "Not enough." Charles's tone was calm. "What?" Armand withdrew his glass, looking at Charles with a puzzled expression. "Land, Armand." Charles explained his purpose. "France needs land to ensure its security. Land is the foundation of everything. Whether it's agriculture or industry, or even food, clothing, shelter, and transportation, everything is built upon the land. Although it's ubiquitous, once monopolized by capitalists, the consequences will be dire." Armand seemed to understand Charles's meaning. "You want me to acquire land for you?" "Yes," Charles nodded. "The right wing has always advocated preserving arable land against industrialization, and they've given farmers many benefits. There's no better buyer than them. And another advantage of having Armand handle it is that it won't arouse suspicion from the capitalists." "How much do you need?" Armand asked, raising his glass to his lips. He assumed Charles only wanted to expand his factory. "All of it," Charles replied, enunciating each word clearly. "All you can buy." Armand nearly spat out a drink he had just taken a sip. He coughed painfully a few times, staring at Charles in astonishment. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 782. That's the British Army's own business. Armand stared blankly at Charles for a long while before asking, "Are you joking, General?" "Buy all the land you can," Charles replied expressionlessly. "Do I look like I'm joking?" "All right." Armand, holding his wine glass, rose and walked to the other end of the living room, taking down a map of France hanging on the wall with one hand and handing it to Charles upon his return. "West of the Meuse River is mostly wheat-producing farmland," Armand listed off with familiarity. "To the west are pastures, and to the south are vineyards, potatoes, and beets." "I only want farmland and pastures," Charles interrupted Armand. "And building land." Charles's purpose in buying farmland was to ensure national security, to guarantee the citizens food and shelter, and to prevent capitalists from controlling the nation's lifeline. Vineyards were mostly used for wine production, which were non-essential consumer goods, and Charles believed there was no need to interfere. Armand breathed a sigh of relief. "A wise choice, General. As you know, farmland in the south is safe, so prices remain high. Even poor quality vineyards cost thousands of dollars per hectare, while good quality ones can cost tens or even hundreds of thousands of dollars." Charles asked, "What about farmland prices?" Armand sat back on the sofa and replied, "Farmland is about $500 per hectare, and there are about 5 million hectares nationwide. Pastures and construction land are slightly cheaper, around $300. Knowing all this, you still plan to buy in large quantities." Charles hummed in agreement. "The initial plan is 1 million hectares of farmland, and 500,000 hectares each of pastures and construction land." Armand whistled. "Do you know how much that costs?" "That's $800 million, General." This was undoubtedly a huge sum. Britain had only borrowed $10 billion from the United States for the entire war, and Charles, with his numerous military-industrial enterprises, mining, shipyards, insurance, shipping, and Romanian oil shares, barely made $20 million a month. Even if all income were used, it would take more than 3 years to pay off this expense. Armand raised his glass to Charles. "I also think it's necessary to remind you, you've reclaimed lost territory and driven the Germans out of France. People have regained confidence in land, so prices are rising. If we buy in large quantities, it will further drive up prices, so, even if you raise enough money, you might end up with much less than this." Charles calmly replied, "That's not something you need to worry about. Armand. You just need to be prepared. Armand readily nodded. Yes, General. As soon as the money is available, I'll help you buy. But he pressed further, but I should at least know when is the right time to buy. Charles's answer was simple. When the British are defeated. Armand suddenly understood Charles's intention. When the British are defeated, people will lose confidence in land again, and the scene of selling off land and fleeing will repeat itself, causing land prices to plummet again. God, Armand sat up abruptly, exclaiming, this is one of the reasons you handed Mace over to the British Expeditionary Force. Charles looked up, a warning glint in his eyes, which immediately silenced Armand. No, I know nothing. Armand smiled awkwardly. I will fulfill my duty, General. You can trust me completely. Charles nodded slowly. You'd better not reveal these things to anyone. Even when you're in bed, understand? Understood? Armand nodded heavily. He dared not provoke Charles, this plague god, a powerful figure in France who could arbitrarily decide the fate of a million-strong army. He also controlled the Second Bureau and a mysterious intelligence system, which even made Armand abandon the idea of making illicit profits during the acquisition. He should just honestly work for him. Only by working for Charles and satisfying him could he guarantee his life and enjoyment. Otherwise, he might as well not exist in this world. After leaving Armand's estate, Charles went to the Salpetriere hospital. Gallery looked much better. He no longer needed assistance to walk around the hallway and do some simple rehabilitation exercises. Charles carefully stayed by his side, his tone tinged with reproach. I heard you brought official business to the hospital? You don't need to worry about that, that's what they told me too, Gallery replied. Lieutenant Colonel Fernand always says, let Charles and his troops worry about it. He's about to recapture all of France, and the reserve army group has almost nothing to do. He paused, turning to Charles with a meaningful look, and asked, but is that really the case? Charles smiled slightly. Gallery saw through his thoughts. It wasn't difficult. The British, because of their stubbornness, and because of marshals and generals like Kitchener and Haig, always lagged behind the French and Germans in tactics and equipment. Under these circumstances, it would be strange if the British Expeditionary Force could defeat the Germans. Aren't you going to offer an explanation? Gallery's voice was reproachful. That needs no explanation, General, Charles replied. They are British troops, our allies. Sharing the burden of the battlefield is their duty, Gallieni retorted. Perhaps I can disregard the British, but they are fighting on our soil. Have you considered the people of Lorraine and Alsace? The front lines will be pushed and pulled back around there. The Germans might even invade the heart of France again, endangering many citizens. French citizens. Charles led Gallieni into the ward and sat him on the bed. You shouldn't be angry now, General. I don't want to either, but this is the best option for France, don't you think? The best option? Gallieni was skeptical. Britain has always been a threat to France, Charles explained. Letting them wear down the Germans, isn't that the best option? Don't you calculate how many fewer soldiers we'll lose? Gallieni was taken aback. He hadn't considered that. It did seem like it could indeed save many French soldiers. Charles added, furthermore, Lorraine and Alsace have been under German rule for many years, and their citizens have lived peacefully with the Germans. Even if they are occupied by the Germans again, they won't be harmed. Gallieni had to admit this. I will withdraw the radicals in advance, Charles said. That way, the Germans will have even less excuse to massacre. Gallieni sighed. Is it really necessary? He was still troubled by the impending disastrous defeat of the British Expeditionary Force. Charles shrugged. That's war, General. Those were the British Army. Their duty was to fight, to face death. Therefore, their deaths cannot be blamed on me. They can only blame their own lack of skill, and the fault of their general and marshal. Chapter 783 Creating Anxiety. The funding problem was actually easy to solve. Charles only needed to create some anxiety in Parliament. He spent the night at the city's garrison headquarters, and the next morning, at Clemenceau's invitation, he accepted parliamentary questioning. Gentlemen, let us welcome the greatest general of France, Lieutenant General Charles. Charles stepped onto the podium amidst enthusiastic applause. Then, Clemenceau slowly unraveled Charles's scheme through questions. Your Excellency Lieutenant General, Clemenceau asked, I heard that your intelligence personnel have learned that the Germans are developing a secret weapon. Is that true? Yes, of course, Charles replied. Could you tell me what kind of equipment this is? Clemenceau asked again. A tank, Charles answered crisply. The members of Parliament showed no sign of alarm. One even shouted, We have the most advanced tanks, Lieutenant General. Yes, your Charles B. won. It gave the Germans a sound thrashing at the Battle of Metz. We destroyed all the enemy's tanks, but only a few of our own malfunctioned. None were destroyed by the enemy. Clemenceau nodded to Charles, signaling for an explanation. Charles puffed out his chest and replied, "Gentlemen, do you think the Germans would just sit and wait to be defeated? No, the Germans' industry and technology are in no way inferior to ours. They are even more advanced. Then why do you think they won't produce even more advanced tanks?" The members of Parliament were stunned. Charles was telling the truth. Although Britain was the world's leading power, considering both industry and technology, the world's number one was the United States, followed by Germany. Charles continued, "Let's make a comparison. The Charles B-1 tank weighs about 25 tons, but do you know how heavy the tank the Germans are developing is? It weighs a whopping 150 tons. Gentlemen." The meeting room erupted in chaos. The members of Parliament turned pale with shock. The 25-ton Charles B-1 was already so formidable, but the Germans were developing a 150-ton tank. That was 6 times the weight of the Charles B-1. One member of Parliament cried out, "Are you sure, General?" "I'm very sure," Charles nodded firmly. "My intelligence personnel have seen this terrifying war machine with their own eyes, but they couldn't photograph it. They could only draw sketches from memory." With that, Charles waved his hand, and the guards immediately distributed the prepared blueprints. Charles explained, "The Germans named it the K-Wagen tank. We don't know much, only that this tank costs a whopping 600,000 marks per unit, and the German military ordered 10. The image above compares the German K-Wagen super heavy tank with the A7V tank." The members of Parliament who received the sketches exclaimed in astonishment, "My God, it's covered in cannons and machine guns. This is a monster, a war machine. Its cannon caliber is even larger than the Charles B-1. It must be 77 millimeters." Charles continued, "Yes, it has 4 77 millimeters infantry guns and 7 Maxim machine guns." This data once again caused panic in the meeting room. Someone asked with skepticism, "They can't produce such a monster that quickly, can they?" Charles shrugged, his tone tinged with helplessness. "I wish that were the case, but unfortunately, that's not the case. They've been developing it for at least a year, and it's almost done now. I estimate they'll rush to production and deploy it to the battlefield as soon as possible." Clemenceau added at the opportune moment, "You know why?" The councillors nodded in agreement. "Yes, Charles is about to reclaim all of France. One more step and will be on German soil, which they absolutely will not allow. They hope to launch a counter-offensive with this weapon." Some dissenting voices emerged. "Is that even possible? The Germans are currently using the LK2 light tank, which weighs only a dozen tons. Suddenly, it's developed to 150 tons, but these doubts were immediately drowned out by the councillors' objections and ridicule. Don't you know how heavy the German A7V is? If you think it's impossible, just think about their Big Bertha giant gun, and their airships. Do you need to wait until this tank is right in front of you before you admit it? This was exactly the situation Charles hoped for. The congressmen had pitifully little military knowledge. They wouldn't consider whether such a super heavy tank was suitable for the battlefield. For example, could its armor be thick enough to withstand enemy artillery fire? Was its speed fast enough? Could the roads and bridges support its weight? In fact, not only congressmen, but even generals of this era rarely understood these things. They took it for granted that more weapons and larger tonnage necessarily meant greater power. At least that's true for warships. Steed asked nervously, "General, can our tanks stop it?" Charles shook his head. "Unfortunately, I don't think so." Clemenceau frowned and asked, "Then you must have a tactic to deal with it, right?" Charles shook his head again. "The appearance of this tank on the battlefield would be a disaster for us, Your Excellency the Prime Minister. It will destroy everything in its path. All our victories will vanish." Charles wasn't telling the truth, of course. But as long as it was useful, that was enough. In particular, most members of Parliament have close ties with capitalists, and they will relay Charles's words to them. Then the capitalists will learn that Charles is not invincible, and France still faces the risk of defeat and being overthrown. So, is it too early to acquire land? If this information then spreads to the general public, individual investors will follow suit and sell their land, further depressing land prices. Finally, someone raised the question Charles most wanted to hear. "So, General, what should we do?" The others echoed, "Yes, General, you must have a way. We can't let France be in danger again. We support you. You can definitely save France again. Charles nodded hesitantly. I don't think there's a better way at the moment. We can only develop a 150-ton tank like the Germans. As you know, only battleships can defeat battleships, and the same goes for tanks. But, the counselors eagerly asked, what difficulties are there? Charles sighed deeply. I've invested too much money in producing war materials, tanks, shells, bullets, and recently, 10 destroyers were donated. Now, the Bernard Group has no extra funds for research and development. Chapter 784 The Cannons of Paris. Ultimately, Charles successfully obtained $30 million in research funding from Parliament. Strictly speaking, this was money the government had to spend, as it concerned national security. Charles was sending them a message: I'm out of money, I can't hold on any longer. The nation's problems can't all be pinned on the Bernard Group, can they? The Bernard Group couldn't stand up to a nation, especially Germany. So the parliamentarians only had two choices: either fall behind or provide the money. Providing the money was inevitable. Parliament, controlled by Charles, usually wouldn't have any surprises. This was more of a formality, telling the capitalists and the public why the money was being given. And this was only the first step. Research funding could be increased at any time. Besides tanks, there were airplanes, warships, artillery, and so on, all requiring investment. This might not even cover the cost of buying land, but that didn't matter. They could simply mortgage Darwaz's factory to the government for a loan. There's a saying, the poor save money, the rich borrow money. Charles was now the latter. The more money she owed the nation, the less the nation would allow the Bernard Group to fail, otherwise she wouldn't be able to recover the loans. For Charles at this time, these were merely formalities. Ironically, the Germans were surprisingly cooperative, providing unexpected assistance in raising funds and suppressing land prices. June arrived, and Paris enjoyed a sunny but not scorching summer. Despite wartime shortages, the trees lining the streets were lush and green, their leaves swaying freely in the breeze, seemingly unaffected by the ongoing war. Suddenly, a sharp whistling sound pierced the air, followed by a deafening explosion along the Seine. Thick smoke billowed, trees were blown about, and broken branches and fallen leaves littered the ground. Startled Parisians screamed and fled in all directions. Several cars collided, but fortunately, only a few were injured. Those who remained calm immediately ran to a phone booth and dialed the police station. Charles was in the town of Darvaz, sitting in his tractor factory office, drinking coffee and reading the newspaper. Joka was busy with mortgage loan matters nearby. If it weren't for Charles's crisp, clean uniform, he would have looked like a typical 996, working from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week, listed company. The defenses on the east bank of the Meuse had been handed over to the British Expeditionary Force, who, using Metz as a base, launched an attack on the flank of the German forces stationed in Alsace and won a victory amidst cheers. British newspapers were jubilant, and Haig even paid to have the victory published in French newspapers. The British Expeditionary Force has proven their bravery and worth. The French army has been unable to conquer Alsace for 46 years, a wish of the French people. Today, the British Expeditionary Force has helped the French people achieve it. This is our glory, our honor and pride. Everyone knew that Haig was subtly telling the French that the British army was superior to the French army, especially Charles. But the French had enough confidence given by Charles. When they saw these reports, they either dismissed them with disdain or laughed them off. Even when discussions broke out, they were mostly mocking. Look at this guy, he seems to have forgotten that Metz was given to him by Charles. If it weren't for Charles, he might already be swimming in the sea, and now he's trying to outdo Charles. He should study for a few more years. When Charles saw Haig's comments in the newspaper, he merely smiled. It was nothing more than Hindenburg's strategy of feigning weakness. He intentionally misled the British into believing that the German army would strategically retreat on the Western Front and would not launch any counter-offensive. After all, this was very much in line with Hindenburg's stance. He had always emphasized East first, West later, and now that he was chief of the General Staff, he would inevitably shrink the Western Front and shift the focus to the Eastern Front. Thus, the British army marched forward in great strides, transferring more than 500,000 troops to the East Coast, and supplies were transported around the clock, preparing to follow the German army into Germany in one fell swoop. Charles could even picture Haig and Kitchener's conversation: any counter-offensive into German territory will be a victory for us. After all, we've taken the first step. Yes, That way we can ignore those clowns back home who look down on us, and let them know that we can defeat the Germans even without Charles. They had no idea that Hindenburg was secretly gathering strength for a counter-offensive. When the two armies, both eager to attack, clashed, who knew what sparks would fly? Charles was impatient. Just as Charles was imagining that scene, the phone rang. Joke answered, listened for a moment, and then looked at Charles in astonishment. There's been an explosion in Paris. They say it's German bombers. Bombers? Charles was taken aback. Was there a lapse in air defense? Before Charles could figure out what was going on, hurried footsteps sounded outside the door, and then Lieutenant Colonel Laurent pushed open the door. General Gallieri requests your return to Paris. It's an emergency. Charles met Gallieri at the Paris City Hall, where he was then the Minister of War. However, Lieutenant Colonel Fernand remained by his side. He was his most capable assistant. The office seemed busy, with the phone constantly ringing and assistants rushing around with documents. Gallieni sat at his desk comparing several photographs. Upon seeing Charles enter, Gallieni gestured for him to come forward. Something strange, Gallieni said, handing the photographs to Charles. Lieutenant Colonel Dura says this could be an enemy pilot successfully crossing the border at high altitude to attack Paris. We're contacting frontline troops and air regiments, hoping to find a loophole in the air defenses. If necessary, you should send an air force to shoot them down. Charles took the photographs and immediately made a judgment. No, these are artillery shells. Artillery shells. Gallieni was taken aback. Yes, Charles said, pointing to the crater. Aerial bombs don't leave such deep craters. They usually explode on the surface of the soil. Only artillery shells do this. Lieutenant Colonel Dura, an intelligence officer, and Gallieni's combat experience predates the widespread use of airplanes, so they were unaware of these things. Gallieri suddenly realized, you said before that the Germans might have a cannon that could reach Paris. The air in the office froze instantly. Everyone stopped what they were doing and looked at Charles, as if a pause button had been pressed. Yes, Charles nodded. Gallieri's expression changed drastically. Lieutenant Colonel Fernand was speechless with shock. The others exchanged bewildered glances, not even noticing the documents falling to the floor. Chapter 785. Why isn't this a good thing? Charles didn't take this to heart, as it didn't affect the overall war situation and he didn't need to concern himself with it. Historically, Germany only deployed the Paris cannon in actual combat in 1918, now it was 2 years earlier. It seemed the Germans were desperate. Or perhaps Hindenburg hoped to use the Paris cannon to demoralize the French army. Charles was about to explain further when he suddenly realized why this wasn't a good thing. This was an opportunity presented to them by the Germans, a great gift from Hindenburg. Once the Paris cannon fired, the uninformed French military and civilians thought the war had gained new variables. After all, they didn't know the Paris cannon was limited in number, assuming it could fire thousands upon thousands of shells in an instant, bombarding for days and nights like artillery on the battlefield. If that were the case, the Germans could easily destroy Paris without launching an attack. Furthermore, there were French artillery positions, train stations, airports, warehouses, railways and highways. Everything would be under the attack of this Paris cannon. How could they possibly fight such a war? Then came the threat, and panic. People even believed France might lose the war, even with Charles. Capitalists sold off land, Parliament continued to pour money into research and development, and countless Parisian citizens rushed to buy insurance from the Bernard Group. Charles seemed to see money flowing into him like a torrent. Thinking this, he feigned alarm. I thought the Germans would need at least another year to develop it, but they've already put it into combat. Even the usually composed General Gallieri panicked. He asked with difficulty, do we have a way to deal with this? Charles shook his head. That's a cannon, General. It fires shells, we can't intercept them, and I believe the Germans will have built fortifications and camouflaged it well. Even if we send bombers, it will be difficult to destroy it. Gallieri nodded heavily. Although he didn't know much about aerial combat, he knew that it wouldn't be difficult for a cannon to evade bombers. Besides using cover, it could also use camouflage nets or release smoke to make it impossible for bombers to find its target. But don't worry too much, Charles said. This is just my guess. It might not necessarily be a cannon. Charles's words were ostensibly meant to comfort, but they actually exacerbated everyone's anxiety. They thought, even Charles hopes it's not, which means Charles can't do anything about it. What should they do? Just as the office fell silent, Another whooshing sound came from the sky, growing sharper and sharper as it approached. A deafening boom followed. The office clearly felt the tremor. The shell seemed to have landed nearby. Galini and Charles rushed to the window and peered out. They saw black smoke billowing from the other end of the street, and several three-story houses had been razed to the ground. People were screaming in panic, some were clutching children and running for cover, some were busy rescuing the wounded, and others lay on the ground covered in blood, calling for help. Galiri watched for a moment, then looked back. "It's pretty much confirmed," Charles hummed in agreement. There was no roar of aircraft engines, but there was the whistling of artillery shells flying through the air. Shells, of course. Galiri hesitated, unsure whether to tell the public the truth. But then, a guard called, "General, we might know what that was. We believe it wasn't a bomber, but artillery shells." Many soldiers heard the whistling of shells. Many of the guards were veterans. They could distinguish the whistling of aerial bombs from artillery shells. Galiri could only sigh and say to Charles, "Looks like we'll have to convene another parliament." In the House of Representatives hall of the Bourbon Palace. The members knew why they had been urgently summoned, but they were unimpressed. Almost everyone guessed it was bombs dropped by German bombers. "It's nothing serious. We all know our fighters have always maintained an advantage over the Germans. All they can do is harass." "Yes, they didn't bomb important targets. Charles will teach them a lesson. I can't wait to see the wreckage of the German bombers." However, when Clemenceau, Galini, and Charles entered the meeting room with grave expressions, the members of Parliament realized that things might not be as simple as they thought. Clemenceau stepped onto the podium and said directly, "Gentlemen, you know what happened. Paris was bombed. As for the reason," Clemenceau glanced at Charles, "I think we should leave that question to the professionals." He then stepped aside and nodded to Charles. Charles, abandoning his usual composure, walked solemnly to the podium. "Gentlemen, before coming here, I dispatched 2 squadrons to patrol over Paris, but we didn't spot any enemy bombers. Do you know what that means?" Charles paused, his gaze sweeping over the bewildered, whispering members of Parliament. "This means that what bombed Paris wasn't enemy bombers, but artillery shells." The meeting room fell silent for a moment, then erupted into chaos. They asked in quick succession, "Artillery shells? Where did they come from? Weren't the Germans driven out? Could it be shells from the border?" The members of Parliament burst into laughter. That was impossible. The straight-line distance between Paris and the border was over 100 kilometers. But Charles nodded expressionlessly. "You guessed right, sir. Those were shells fired from the border." The members of Parliament were all stunned. Then someone shouted, "That's impossible. We all know shells can only go a dozen kilometers. Even naval guns can only go 20 kilometers, and that's a British battleship." The members of Parliament were referring to the main guns of Britain's most advanced battleship, the Queen Elizabeth, which were 381 millimeters in diameter and had a maximum range of 21,700 meters. In fact, not only did the other members of Parliament not believe it, but even Wells instead looked at Charles with doubt. Only Armand, who knew nothing about military and industrial matters, seemed unfazed, lazily leaning back in his chair, watching everything with a half-smile. Charles reaffirmed his statement, "I believe it's artillery, and many who have been on the battlefield believe it is. Unless you have more battlefield experience than we do, you should choose to believe it." Galiri rose to face the councillors, his face somewhat pale. "Nothing is impossible, gentlemen. Think of Grand Bertha. The Germans were capable of doing that. Otherwise, how do we explain the absence of aircraft engine sounds, and our fighters couldn't find the bombers, even if there were explosions in Paris below? So, yes, the Germans possess this kind of artillery, capable of striking Paris from the border." The councillors were stunned. But the astonishment on their faces proved that they were accepting this explanation. Chapter 786 Hindenburg Line. Although the parliamentary debate had ended, the bombing and panic continued. Shells bombarded Paris roughly every 20 minutes, some hit the suburbs without causing damage, but those hitting Paris consistently resulted in casualties. Reports poured onto Galini's desk. Galini had moved to the city's defense headquarters, where he could better command a reserve army group. However, he was more involved with a police station next door than the reserve army group. Soldiers were ineffective in the situation, and the police were severely understaffed. In desperation, Galini had to allocate soldiers to the police, who then directed the soldiers in disaster relief, traffic control, and maintaining order. However, the dangers continued to mount. Lieutenant Colonel Fernand, clutching documents, reported nervously, "A building on Avenue Charles V has been destroyed, resulting in 8 deaths and 32 injuries. A large crater was blown up near the Paris train station, killing 7 and injuring 23. Train services are suspended. Avenue Stable has been destroyed, killing 4 and injuring 25. Traffic is disrupted." Enough, Galleri interrupted Lieutenant Colonel Fernand. Although he regretted the civilian casualties, he understood that a general shouldn't be preoccupied with tactical issues, he should address the problem from a higher strategic perspective. He turned his gaze to Charles, who sat at his staff desk staring at a map, his tone anxious. "You know the point isn't that?" "Yes, General," Charles replied calmly, "the point is the public panic. Shops are closed, traffic is disrupted, even the metro is shut down. This will affect normal life in Paris, and even industrial production." Note, the Paris metro was built and put into operation in 1900, but this was exactly what Charles wanted, even exceeding his expectations. Capitalists were selling off their assets at rock-bottom prices, not just land, but also power plants, textile mills, food processing plants, and more. A rumor was circulating. The problem was that the Germans didn't have enough of these cannons now. As their numbers increased, the rate of fire wouldn't be one shot every 20 minutes, but several shots per minute. Would Paris even exist then? Everything became worthless, asset prices halved overnight, yet no one was interested, and prices continued to fall. Meanwhile, Charles's insurance company was raking in profits, its doors nearly broken down by customers. A solution? Galleri stared at Charles. "I need a solution," Charles shrugged, replying with difficulty. "There's no solution, General. If there's, it's only by advancing into German territory and forcing them to surrender." Charles was telling the truth, but also not entirely. The truth was, there was no need to worry. The Germans didn't have many Paris cannons, especially since these cannons were particularly prone to barrel damage, requiring them to be sent back to the factory for reaming after every 50 rounds. Note, burning the barrel means that the cannon is so worn that it is no longer suitable for firing the original caliber shells. It is sent back to the factory to be machined smooth so that it can fire larger caliber shells. Therefore, the scenario that the people of Paris imagined, where more and more of these cannons are produced and eventually bombard Paris, will never happen. But as long as Charles doesn't say anything, who would know? "I've also heard that the Germans are building a Hindenburg line." Charles handed a map to Galleri, drawing a line along the border with his finger. "It's located in the Lorraine and Alsace area." "You know why?" Galleri nodded heavily. "If they had Paris cannons that could bombard Paris from within their own borders, then there would be no need to attack. They could just hold the line and continuously produce Paris cannons to bombard Paris. One day, Paris would collapse." "Can you break through this line?" Galleri asked. Charles shook his head again. "This defensive line is much shorter than the Western line, and it was specifically designed for armored forces." He then handed Galleri a sketch. "This is a diagram of the defensive line observed by frontline soldiers. It's clear the Germans are well prepared, they've even changed their tactics." The above diagram shows the Hindenburg line, featuring dedicated anti-tank ditches and extensive barbed wire. A sentry line was also established in front of the main line, with a small number of soldiers on guard and artillery to inflict heavy casualties on the enemy. Galleri glanced at the sketch and sighed. "That's because Hindenburg came to power. His fighting style is completely different from Falkenhayn's." "It's not just that, General," Charles cautioned. "If Hindenburg has constructed such a strong defensive line that we cannot break through, they can bombard our vulnerable lines at any time while simultaneously bombarding them with Paris artillery. Our army will be overwhelmed, and this will severely damage our morale and confidence." Galleri exclaimed. "That's right. We either need to break through this line, or we need to build a similar one." This was Galleri's statement, not Charles's. After leaving the city's defense headquarters, Charles flew to Betzelis to see Pétain and provided him with a similar sketch of the Hindenburg line. Pétain, a staunch defender, frowned upon seeing the sketch. This is real? There are reinforced concrete bunkers behind. These bunkers can store ammunition and food, and are perfect shelters from artillery fire. Such a defensive line is almost impenetrable." The image above is a cross-section of the Hindenburg line, the prototype of the famous Siegfried Line in post-war Germany, which faced the French Maginot Line. "Of course it's real, Major General," Charles replied. "The Germans are playing a very long game. They are trying to replicate their success at the Battle of the Somme, aiming to inflict heavy casualties on our troops." "Yes," Pétain nodded emphatically. The Germans are severely understrengthened in several fronts. They can only hope to increase their casualty ratio against us through defensive lines. Only in this way can they possibly win, and we— Pétain looked up at Charles. Lieutenant General, if I may be frank, we also need a defensive line, a similar one, even stronger than the Germans. I'm not sure, Major General, Charles replied. But General Gallieni said the same thing. I don't know if General Foch will object, and there's also Parliament. We need Parliament's support. This is a massive undertaking. And this project will naturally fall into the hands of the Bernard Group. Charles certainly doesn't want it to be something they propose, produce, and ultimately profit from. Therefore, Pétain taking the lead, with Gallieni's support, is the best solution. The Bernard Group only needs to passively reap the benefits from behind. Then one day, the capitalists will suddenly realize that Bernard has grasped the lifeline of France. Chapter 787 Business Plans. Joka didn't understand Charles's actions. When Charles returned to Darvaz and handed Joka a list of acquisitions, he was almost shocked. Charles— Joka glanced at the several pages of the list, looked at Charles with doubt, and asked with difficulty, "Are you sure you want to buy all of these?" Charles nodded firmly. "But this is too risky." Joka flipped through the list: electricity, construction, cement, and telephone and telegraph companies. "I must remind you, it's good that you want to expand, but you can't rush it. We don't understand many of these industries. In fact, we know nothing about them." Charles's attitude was firm. "I know, Father, but we have to buy. Not only buy, but we must maintain a continuous investment." Joka was taken aback. "Which one?" Charles replied, "All of them." "But that's impossible." Joka looked incredulous, shaking the list. "Even if we acquire a batch of existing companies, we can't compete with rivals who have been in business for decades in terms of technology. We're not omnipotent, we can surpass them." Charles was confident. "Why?" Joka asked, puzzled. "Because I have the power to decide who gets the orders," Charles replied. Joka instantly understood what Charles meant. Charles must know something, or rather, what he planned to build in the future. The companies he was acquiring now were merely preparations for that future. If these companies could continue to receive orders from the state, perhaps that would indeed be the case, and even industry talent would be attracted to these companies. After all, these companies would have orders and work, while other companies that didn't receive orders could only barely survive or even go bankrupt. Thinking of this, Djokovic stopped asking questions. Perhaps it was better for him not to know some things. After everything was arranged, Charles went to the City Defense Command headquarters. Charles arrived in Paris at around 8 p.m., and it was pitch black all around except for the light in Gallieni's lounge. Gallieni had been busy and overwhelmed with the Paris cannon incident during the day, and exhausted. He planned to sort out the losses before going to rest. He wasn't surprised to see Charles come in. "You've finally come," he said. Charles grunted. "I hope you're not too worried about the Paris cannon incident, General." "That's it." Gallieni lowered his pince-nez glasses, rolling his eyes at Charles. "Yes." Charles placed the basket of apples he had brought on the table, avoiding Gallieni's gaze. "Your injury has just healed. You shouldn't be worrying about these things." Gallieni smiled. "Or perhaps, everything you told me before was a lie." Charles turned to look at Gallieni with a puzzled expression. "I thought it was flawless." "How did you see through it?" "You are indeed flawless." Gallieni pushed the documents in his hand aside. "But you underestimated your abilities." "What?" Charles asked, puzzled. Gallieni narrowed his eyes. "I've known you for almost 2 years, Lieutenant General. I've watched you rise to where you are today. I've never seen Charles stumped by any problem, nor have I ever seen Charles panic. You're overacting. You should at least offer a plausible solution." Charles was speechless. It turned out this old man knew his own capabilities. "Speak." Gallieni closed his pen, took off his pince-nez, and placed them aside. "What method do you have to deal with this thing?" "No way." Charles's answer was simple. Gallieni's face turned cold. Was this kid going to rebel? "I'm telling the truth, General," Charles quickly explained. "What I mean is, we don't need to worry about this." "Why?" Gallieni was skeptical. "Because it's expensive to manufacture." Charles pulled up a chair and sat opposite Gallieni. "My intelligence personnel have learned that the Germans produced a total of 9 of these cannons, but only about 3 can fire at any given time. The others need maintenance, rotation, or have their barrels enlarged at the factory." This was information Charles knew in modern times, but he could, of course, attribute the source to the lady in white. Gallieni secretly breathed a sigh of relief upon hearing this. So, these cannons will never be mass-produced, at most only like they are now, and possibly even fewer. Yes, Charles nodded. Gallieni then frowned again. But why don't you tell everyone the truth? Is there some kind of plan? Of course. Charles hesitated for a moment. However, it's not a military plan, it's a business plan. What? Gallieni seemed genuinely angry. You mean, you're doing this to make money? You could say that. Charles nodded. You? Gallieni was so angry he couldn't speak for a long time. He pointed his finger in the air. Do you know how much of an impact this has had? Everyone lives in fear. Paris is in chaos. Refugees are crowding the bus stations, not to mention cars. Even horse-drawn carriages are full of men, women, and children leaving the capital. And you're telling me that all of this is for making money? Charles calmly replied, it's for making money, but it's also for the benefit of the citizens. That won't do. None of this can be an excuse. Gallieni's voice was full of anger. You should have made it public tomorrow. No, you should do it now. Suddenly, Gallieni realized something and looked at Charles in confusion. What did you say? For the benefit of the citizens. Yes, Charles nodded. Do you know what France was like before the war? The nation's vital industries were in the hands of big capitalists. They used these to constantly harvest the wealth of the citizens and even influence national decisions. Parliament, the army, and the government were all filled with their people. During the war, these capitalists dared not do anything because the citizens were united against the enemy. Anyone who dared to interfere was endangering national security and treason. But once peacetime arrives, they can do whatever they want within the framework of the law. Gallieni understood. You want to wrest these vital industries back from the capitalists? Yes. Gallieni's expression softened slightly, but after a moment's thought, he asked thoughtfully, but if you succeed, it means all power is concentrated in your hands, which is tantamount to de facto dictatorship. Charles didn't deny it. I think that's better than a bunch of idiots governing the country, don't you think? Gallieni fell silent. He trusted Charles, but lacked confidence in dictatorship. However, he believed that at least during wartime, Charles's approach was correct. Parliament was always a hindrance. Chapter 788 Independence Tank. Lorraine, located in eastern France, experiences its rainy season several months earlier than other regions. Frequent thunderstorms begin in early May, followed by continuous drizzle and occasional downpours in June. In Metz, though it was morning, the sky was as dark as night. Large raindrops pounded the river, splashing and causing the water to swell. Haig's command post was located at the Metz Grand Theatre, which he considered the most suitable place to reorganize his troops. His reorganization was for the offensive, to be the first to set foot on German territory and declare the might and victory of the British Expeditionary Force. He hadn't considered the defense of Metz at all. The Germans were unlikely to attack Metz, it was French territory, and as a British general, he certainly wouldn't consider building fortifications or defenses there. However, the Hindenburg Line stood in the way of the British Army. Several attacks, resulting in over 30,000 casualties, failed to advance an inch. Those cunning Germans, Haig cursed bitterly. They anticipated this situation and made preparations in advance. Yes, Major General Zygrin, the newly appointed Chief of Staff of the Expeditionary Force, agreed. The Germans were building this line when we attacked Alsace, and it's now largely complete. We should break through this line as quickly as possible, Haig muttered impatiently as he stood up. Otherwise, the German line will only become more solid and harder to break through. Watching Haig pace back and forth at his desk, Major General Zygrin cautiously suggested, perhaps we could involve the 1st Tank Division in the battle. They're equipped with new tanks, and their firepower is said to be extremely powerful. This might be helpful. Zygrin spoke so conservatively because he knew Haig was unwilling to acknowledge the role of tanks, even though Charles had already proven their value on the battlefield. Equipped with new tanks? Haig asked casually. Yes, Kegel replied, it's a tank called Independence, equipped with 1 cannon and 4 machine guns. The image above shows the Independence, developed by Britain in 1924. It was the world's first multi-turret tank, with 4 turrets equipped with Maxim machine guns distributed around the main turret. This design reflected Britain's preference for using tanks as fire support for infantry, making it Britain's first infantry tank. Haig was instantly interested when he heard that the tank had 1 cannon and 4 machine guns, but then he thought for a moment and shook his head with disdain. It won't be equipped with 4 machine guns like the Whippet, will it? It won't be very useful, General, Kegel said. Perhaps you could have the tank division commander explain it to him? He knows the tank's performance better. All right, Haig nodded, his tone somewhat reluctant. He felt that any attention paid to the tank force would be a slap in the face and affect his authority in the army. Soon, Monty appeared before Haig, a briefcase tucked under his left hand. By this time, he had been promoted to major. However, as commander of the 1st Tank Division, he often felt awkward having many officers of higher ranks under his command. Haig leaned back in his chair, pretending to review documents, and casually asked, "I heard you've equipped yourselves with new tanks." "Yes, General," Monty said, taking photos and data files from his briefcase and handing them over. "This is a tank designed and produced in accordance with my operational concepts." Haig took the files and glanced at them. "Your operational concepts?" "Yes," Major Monty straightened up. "My ideas differ from Charles's. I believe the more important role of tanks is to accompany infantry in breaking through lines, preventing casualties similar to those in the Battle of the Somme. Therefore, it should emphasize protection and firepower, rather than speed." Haig appreciated the first sentence most. Different from Charles's, that was the right thing to do. Britain was the world's leading power. It should have its own operational concepts and designs, leading the way and teaching others how to fight, instead of blindly following Charles's lead, a disgrace to the British Empire. Haig didn't look at the data, he glanced at the tank, his gaze immediately drawn to its multiple turret designs. "Let me guess," Haig's eyes lit up, "each turret is operated by a single person and can operate independently." "Right, of course, General," Monty replied. "It's an improvement over the Whippet. While the Whippet also had 4 machine guns, it lacked a turret and couldn't rotate, severely limiting its operational angle and effectiveness." "A fantastic improvement," Haig praised, putting down his pen and sitting up straight, picking up the data file to compare. After a while, Haig frowned again. "But the Germans dug a 21-meter-long anti-tank ditch. Can it cross it?" "No, we don't cross anti-tank ditches," Monty replied. "Don't cross?" Haig looked at Monty in surprise. "Yes," Monty responded, straightening up. "The Charles has bridging vehicles, but they can only cross 18 meters. The Hindenburg Line clearly constructed anti-tank ditches specifically to prevent its crossing." Haig nodded slightly. This was their previous conclusion. The Germans were clearly targeting Charles's bridging vehicles, so they increased the anti-tank ditch to 21 meters, extending it to the front of the main defensive line at varying elevations, making it difficult for the bridging armored vehicles to function effectively. Monty then took a draft of the defensive line from his briefcase and handed it to Haig. "My idea is this: when the tanks reach the anti-tank ditch, they shouldn't cross it, but instead maneuver along the ditch to provide close-range fire suppression against the Germans. Even if they are destroyed by the Germans, their wreckage will obstruct their view, leaving the Germans with only an ironclad defense and a cloud of smoke. This can cover our soldiers' advance, while the anti-tank ditch is unlikely to stop an infantry charge." Haig slammed his hand on the table. "That's right, Major Monty, that's what I was saying. The main force in combat is always the infantry. They are the decisive factor on the battlefield. Everything else should be secondary to the infantry, and tanks are no exception." Haig shook hands with Major Monty, believing he had discovered a rare talent. Incredibly, he had only realized this now. "You shouldn't be a major," Haig politely invited Monty to sit on the sofa. "I'll speak to London and have them expedite your promotion." "Thank you very much, General," Monty was flattered. "You deserve it." Haig looked at the documents in his hand with satisfaction. Your tanks, and the tactics that go with them, I believe they will excel on the battlefield. Even surpassing Charles, British officers should trample French officers underfoot. The French army has geniuses, and so does Britain. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 789. The rain poured down, thick and misty. The leaden sky, like a sheet of iron, weighed heavily on the land along the Franco-German border. Water quickly pooled into puddles, only to be disrupted by subsequent drops, creating muddy ripples. German soldiers, clad in raincoats, methodically continued constructing their unfinished fortifications in their trenches, as usual. Across the way, in the British trenches, Major Monty could vaguely see the water and mud thrown out by the Germans through his binoculars. Occasionally, Monty envied the Germans. Their soldiers could construct trenches perfectly, no matter the circumstances. The British and French, on the other hand, were lucky if their trenches didn't collapse or flood in the rain. Any improvement would require divine intervention. The colonial troops were even worse off. The Afrika Korps struggled even with simple trenches. Beside Monty, British soldiers stood silently in neat rows in the trench, rifles at their sides. Rain streamed down their helmets, soaking their faces. Unease filled their eyes, their chests heaving as if weighed down by a stone. Some trembled slightly, yet they desperately suppressed the urge to flee. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Why don't they let Charles command? At least they could hear his opinion. Yes, we're allies. A single word from Charles could prevent thousands of casualties. Why not? Keep your voice down. Do you think our commander-in-chief would admit he's inferior to Charles? Silence fell. The soldiers were only risking their lives, but the generals were losing face. Suddenly, 3 red signal flares shot into the sky with a piercing whistle, their red light illuminating the soldiers' terrified faces, flickering like blood. Boom. 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 A dense barrage of artillery fire instantly rained down on the German lines. Shells exploded in massive flashes upon impact, illuminating the debris and mud tossed into the air. Shells continued to pound the ground, turning the once flat positions into craters, and scattering pieces of barbed wire everywhere. The firing guns were British 6-inch $30 and $20 howitzers. After more than a month of rest and reorganization, in an effort to regain their strength, the British had transported over 300 large-caliber artillery pieces and hundreds of thousands of shells from their homeland in the United States, and were now relentlessly bombarding the German positions. The bombardment continued for half an hour without stopping, only gradually advancing deeper into the German lines. A sharp whistle blew, echoing across the trenches, accompanied by the hysterical shouts of officers. Forward, lads, kill them all, today is a good day to die, let us fight for glory, victory's ours, take up your rifles. Tanks led the way, emerging from the trenches along the slope, followed by soldiers crawling out like ants, a dense, overwhelming mass, like a pale green ocean. By this point in the battle, a skirmish charge, like Charles's, should have been the consensus. But in the eyes of the stubborn Haig, while a skirmish charge would reduce casualties, it would also diminish the impact on the enemy lines. The main assault force is infantry. Without density, even if the soldiers rush into the trenches, they won't be able to breach them. We shouldn't make this basic mistake. Haig firmly believed this, and therefore insisted on a dense charge against all opposition. The soldiers didn't believe him, but they had no choice, they had no say and could only follow orders. The only solace they found was the 5 turrets on the new tank. Hoping they would prove useful, the British soldiers silently crossed themselves. Suddenly, the whistling of artillery shells grew louder, bursts of fire erupting through the crowd as screams filled the air. Blood, limbs, and pieces of flesh and internal organs, unidentified parts, splattered down, turning even the rain red. Suddenly, another burst of fire erupted as a tank was blasted into a fireball, still propelled forward by its momentum. Hold on, the officer shouted, waving his pistol. Stay behind the tank, it will protect us. Before he could finish, a shell exploded near him, the shockwave throwing him several meters to the ground. Passing soldiers clearly saw the officer covered in blood, his face shattered like broken porcelain, cracked and bleeding from his eyes, nose, and mouth. He struggled a few times, then kicked his legs and lay still. The sounds of artillery fire were mixed with sporadic gunfire. This was good news for the British soldiers, as it meant they were approaching the enemy lines. However, when the soldiers peeked out from behind the tanks, they discovered it was merely the Germans' frontline outpost. The outpost was utterly vulnerable. It crumbled in less than 10 minutes under the relentless British onslaught. The new recruits cheered with high spirits, assuming the new tanks were the key to their success and that the next line of defense would be just as easily breached. But the veterans looked grim, their lips pale with tension, some quickly retreating into the trenches they had just captured. The veterans knew that before retreating, the Germans on the outpost would usually report to their artillery positions by telephone. The enemy has entered our position, open fire in 5 minutes. Sure enough, a short while later, shells rained down on the British troops, creating a bloody spectacle. Charles was in Bishanksea with Digenny, watching a motorized unit exercise. The German 105mm howitzers had been successfully converted into truck-mounted artillery, significantly improving their marching and deployment speed. The most important thing is communication, Charles instructed Tycoon. These units are mobile, meaning they mostly have to use radios to communicate with frontline troops. Tycoon looked troubled. But radios are very unreliable, they often malfunction. Moreover, we need to achieve what you call fire and go, which leaves us almost no time to set up radios. Long-range artillery is practically blind without frontline artillery observers reporting coordinates. Thus, communication became a major problem. It will be improved, Charles said. The current solution is to equip more radios as backups. Also, train a group of qualified radio operators, requiring them to be quick and capable of repairs, otherwise, no number of backup radios would be enough. Yes, General, Tycoon responded. At that moment, a communications soldier ran to Charles and handed him a telegram. General, the British have launched an attack on the German lines. They are said to have deployed new tanks. He also handed over a sketch, drawn based on the intelligence personnel's dictation. Charles took the sketch and almost burst out laughing. Trying to break through the Hindenburg line with infantry tanks? That was suicidal. Chapter 790. I'm more concerned with how to defend. Unlike Charles, Tycoon showed great interest in the HMS Independence tank. A fantastic tank, Tycoon said, walking over to Charles with his coffee. His eyes lit up when he saw the sketches. Although they copied the Charles A1's rotating gun turret, the 4 machine gun turrets provide excellent cover. Tycoon had commanded the Charles B1 and believed its strengths were obvious, thick armor and powerful firepower. However, its weaknesses were equally pronounced. Without machine gun cover, it was almost defenseless against enemy infantry in close combat, easily approached and destroyed. Therefore, when he saw the British HMS Independence's 4 machine gun turrets, his immediate impression was that it addressed the shortcomings of the Charles B1. Charles smiled slightly. Do you know the key design principles of a tank? Tycoon shrugged. He only knew how to command tanks in combat or appreciate equipment with the eye of an artist. He didn't have the energy to delve into its intricacies. The crew should be as small as possible. Charles gestured with his chin toward the Independence tank. Take a look at how many people this tank needs. Tycoon understood somewhat. Maybe 7, 8 to be precise, Charles corrected. 4 machine gunners, a gunner, a loader, a driver, and a commander. Ordinary tanks can have the commander also act as the loader or gunner, but the Independence multi-turret tank couldn't. The reason was that there were too many people, and the firepower would be directed in multiple directions. The commander needed to be aware of everything, simultaneously directing the driver and the output of 4 machine guns and 1 cannon. In the tense atmosphere of the battlefield, even a full-time commander would be overwhelmed. A part-time commander certainly couldn't manage it all. Tycoon understood. So, even just coordinating with itself is a big problem for this kind of tank. Lorraine, the Franco-German border battlefield. The Independence tank was slowly approaching the enemy lines, appearing orderly on the surface, but internally in chaos. Captain, enemy infantry gun spotted 50 meters ahead. They're aiming. The tank commander hurriedly shouted to the gunner, take it out. We can't aim unless we stop the tank. No, we can't stop. Stopping will make us the target. The tank commander turned to the machine gunner. Machine gun suppression. We haven't spotted any infantry guns. Captain, we're surrounded by friendly fire. I haven't spotted any either. The tank commander shouted. 1 o'clock position. Quick. Machine gun number 2. Prepare. Before the machine gun could even turn, boom, the German infantry gun had already hit the tank, crippling it. For the 8 tank crew members, let alone coordinated combat, even basic communication and reporting data inside the rumbling tank was difficult. Therefore, before the development of communication tools, the most flexible and practical tank was actually the 2-crew Char A1. The 4-crew Char B1 tank was acceptable because its division of labor was very clear. The rotating turret was mainly used for tank warfare, while the 75mm gun on the hull was used to support the infantry, and the gunners knew what to do and when. Schall continued his analysis, holding the sketches. Another drawback of multiple turrets is the severe lack of internal space in the tank. Ammunition capacity and armor thickness will all be problematic. Tycoon nodded in agreement. While the tank crew isn't heavy, they require ample space. 8 people crammed inside need to be able to turn around and move, and the commander might also need to move to give orders. This means the tank, while heavily armed, has insufficient ammunition, and its armor can't be too thick. Lieutenant, we're out of ammunition, the commander hurriedly ordered. Unload the ammunition from machine guns 3 and 4, and replenish 1 and 2. The commander felt that the 3rd and 4th machine gun turrets at the rear were completely redundant. For almost the entire battle, their guns were pointed at their own men. What idiot would make such a design? The commander complained. They didn't consider battlefield practicality at all. When would the 3rd and 4th machine guns be of any use? Probably when the tank charges into enemy lines, but then there are their own infantry behind them, right? So what's the point of these 2 machine gun turrets? Just then, a sharp clang rang out as the tank was pierced from the front by a German armor-piercing shell. The 8 crew members inside screamed and collapsed in pools of blood amidst flying shrapnel and armor fragments. The Independence tank's frontal armor was designed to be only 28 mm thick. Although it had been temporarily increased to 35 mm and sandbags added, it was still vulnerable to penetration by German anti-tank guns at close range. In the end, they will stop at the anti-tank ditch, Charles said, pointing to the Hindenburg Line's defensive map. They hope to suppress the Germans with the Independence's powerful firepower, while using the tank's armor to provide cover for the infantry, allowing them to charge into the enemy trenches and engage in hand-to-hand combat. Is there anything wrong with that? Tycoon asked, puzzled. If you were in command, he might have used this tactic as well. Tanks can indeed provide cover, Major General, Charles said, but they can also become obstacles to the soldiers' advance, especially since the Germans are equipped with flamethrowers. Streams of fire shot down towards the British troops on the other side of the anti-tank ditch. The agonizing screams of British soldiers echoed across the battlefield, where writhing, leaping flames terrified the British troops behind them, halting their advance. Tanks were not spared either. While the flames couldn't burn through the steel plates, they overheated the engines, rendering them unusable. If any tanks leaked oil during the battle, it would immediately ignite and explode. German machine guns continued their fury, bullets crisscrossing through the flames as they fired at the advancing British troops, felling them one by one. Bodies piled up like small mountains inside and outside the anti-tank ditches, blood staining the ditches and the stagnant water, turning the entire world red. A telegram reached Charles. The British attack had failed. Several hours of fighting had resulted in the loss of over 200 new tanks and more than 30,000 soldiers, a carnage comparable to the Somme. Tycoon whistled, not without sarcasm, and said, "These troops and tanks are enough for us to form another armored corps." Then, he asked Charles curiously, "If it were you, General, how would you break through this Hindenburg line?" Charles calmly replied, "If it were me, I'd be more concerned with defense than offense." Defense? Tycoon was taken aback. Then he understood. "You mean the Germans will counterattack?" Charles nodded. The German commander was Hindenburg, and he wanted to prove his command abilities to the Germans, to prove he was superior to Buckingham, to prove he was capable of becoming the German chief of the general staff, or even the emperor behind the scenes. Therefore, he certainly wouldn't wait and see. He would do his best to demonstrate his strength. Chapter 791 Charles's Conspiracy. The rain poured down harder, washing over the corpses on the battlefield, seemingly cleansing their misfortune. The British soldiers had given up on collecting the bodies. There were too many to handle. Many corpses were just tens of meters from the enemy lines, and going to collect them without a ceasefire would be tantamount to suicide. A heavy silence fell over the British soldiers in the trenches. The wounded huddled under their raincoats, bandaging their wounds, but it was useless. The rain would quickly soak everything dry, including the bandages. Captain Charles pulled out a cigarette from his pocket, only to find it had turned to ash. Frustrated, he crumpled it up and threw it on the ground. Brian approached him and offered the captain a cigarette. "Have mine, I have some more." "Thanks, Brian." Captain Charles nodded, taking the cigarette and giving Brian a grateful look. Captain Charles desperately needed it. Even if he were to die any second, he wanted a puff. He carefully lit the cigarette under his raincoat, took a deep drag, and then exhaled a thick cloud of smoke with satisfaction. "Have you heard, Captain?" Brian glanced around and whispered, "Charles warned us." Captain Charles gave a bitter smile. "Do we need a warning? Everyone knows we're doomed." "No, Captain," Brian said, "Charles thinks the Germans will attack, and he thinks we should organize a defense." "A defense?" Captain Charles was taken aback. "Yes, a defense," Brian nodded. "If what Charles said is true, we're completely unprepared." Brian looked around the trenches. Because of the continuous rain and the British offensive strategy, the fortifications were hastily constructed, with some sections even flooded and inaccessible. These areas became clear gaps in the defenses, easily breached by the enemy. Brian's words drew the attention of the others, who gathered around, bombarding him with questions. Is what you said true? Did Charles really say that? What did General Haig say? Does he agree with Charles's assessment? Brian answered them one by one. Of course it's true. Michael told me. He's the communications officer at headquarters. As for Haig, if he agrees with Charles, would we still need to prepare for an attack here? You know Haig's tactics. He believes a fast-paced attack can break the enemy. The soldiers fell silent again. After a while, someone else chimed in, unwilling to give up. Why didn't he believe Charles's warning? Yes, Charles's combat experience far surpasses his. Charles's assessment of the battlefield has never been wrong. Charles maintains an undefeated record, while Haig has almost never won a battle, yet he arrogantly disregards Charles. Captain Charles sighed. You know why? Because we are British, we are the strongest force in the world, and my generals, they believe they should lead all wars. They won't allow Charles to point fingers at us. That would be considered interference and overstepping his authority. The soldiers were utterly speechless. Only the sound of wind and rain filled the trenches, and the thud of raindrops hitting their helmets, like a barrage of bullets relentlessly pounding on their fragile souls. Maze, Haig's command post. Haig flew into rage upon receiving Charles's warning, slamming the telegram on the table. That arrogant fellow. What makes him think the Germans will launch a counterattack? What's his basis? Or is it just subjective conjecture, a guess? Chief of Staff Kurger echoed, the Germans certainly won't choose to attack. They've built such a strong defensive line, they can comfortably stay in their trenches. Why would they come out to fight us? He had originally intended to say, the Germans can win by staying in their trenches, but felt that didn't sound right. Of course, Haig nodded firmly. If the Germans launch an attack as he says, that's exactly what I want to see. Then they'll lose the cover of their trenches, while we'll have a numerical advantage. No one would be that foolish, especially the Germans. Kurger considered for a moment, then reminded him, General, this might be Charles's scheme. Haig was taken aback. Yes, Kurger analyzed, Charles's statement is likely to cater to some psychology of the soldiers. Haig instantly understood. The heavy losses suffered by the troops during the offensive would make the soldiers more inclined to defense than offense. After all, defense is much simpler and safer than offense. Offense requires soldiers to jump out of the trenches and charge into enemy shells and bullets, falling in droves along the way. Defense, on the other hand, only requires building fortifications in the trenches, using shovels or setting up barbed wire. At this time, a warning from a highly influential general like Charles to the British Expeditionary Force to favor defense could potentially undermine the morale and confidence of the entire army. That bastard, Haig said, his face pale with anger, his intentions are extremely sinister. He hopes I will never be able to break through the German lines. Then, without further hesitation, he coldly ordered, block the news. Don't let Charles's warning reach the army. Yes, General. Also, Haig pointed his finger in the air. I don't want to hear anything about defense. Understand? Understood, Kidgel responded. Haig was right about one thing. This was indeed Charles's conspiracy. However, he hadn't guessed Charles's purpose. Tidjany didn't understand the warning to the British either. That's the British's business. Why should we issue a warning? Tidjany asked. Besides, you know the British are arrogant and stubborn. They won't believe your warning, especially Haig. I know, Charles replied calmly. Tidjany asked curiously, you know? Yet you still want to warn them. Precisely because I know. Charles nodded slightly. That's why I want to warn them. Tidjany was completely bewildered. What kind of logic was this? Knowing Haig wouldn't believe him, knowing he wouldn't pay attention, yet still issuing a warning. Charles explained calmly, we all know there are serious problems within the British Expeditionary Force, the colonial army, and even the British themselves, are questioning Haig's military capabilities. If, at this point, he makes another serious mistake, Tidjany suddenly understood, gesturing thoughtfully with a finger to his lips, you gave him the correct answer, but he refused to believe it. In the end, the Germans launched an attack just as you predicted, inflicting heavy losses on the British. Then, all the British officers and soldiers will blame Haig. Tidjany stared at Charles in disbelief, exclaiming sincerely, you're a monster, General. This transcends the realm of art. Chapter 792 The German Counter-Offensive. In fact, it wasn't just British generals like Haig who didn't believe the Germans would counterattack. Even Hindenburg's deputy, Ludendorff disagreed. The image above shows German General Ludendorff, who served as Hindenburg's deputy during World War I. The two were described as having a close, almost husband and wife-like relationship. When Hindenburg was appointed chief of the general staff, Ludendorff was appointed quartermaster general, equivalent to deputy chief of the general staff. From then on, Hindenburg controlled the army, and Ludendorff controlled logistics. They effectively became military dictators. Marshal Ludendorff asked Hindenburg, holding the battle reports from the past few days, "Our casualty ratio against the enemy is almost 1:7. We are on the verge of victory. Why not continue to maintain this advantage?" Hindenburg grunted in agreement. Ludendorff was more adept at politics and interpersonal relationships. He lacked sufficient decisiveness and vision in military and strategic matters. This was one of the reasons why Hindenburg could get along so well with him. A deputy is a deputy, even if he tries to claim credit for himself. Military power ultimately rests in Hindenburg's hands. Ludendorff's role is limited to supplementing Hindenburg's diplomatic skills. "Do you consider our victory over the British a victory?" Hindenburg calmly countered. "Isn't it?" Ludendorff was puzzled. "No, Eric," Hindenburg replied, taking down his still smoking pipe, "we have only one opponent, and that is Charles. Although we are fighting the British with a casualty ratio of 1:7, we are constantly losing one. Understand?" Ludendorff gave a half-understanding "oh." Hindenburg probably saw the bigger picture. He was unwilling to expend resources on the British Expeditionary Force before facing Charles, even though it was a victory for Germany. Furthermore, Hindenburg added, "British casualties are meaningless to us, but their supplies are not." Ludendorff understood. "Continuing like this, we can't capture British supplies. But an offensive will." Hindenburg nodded, stood up, and looked westward from the window. British supplies had already arrived in Metz in large quantities. It was almost time for a counter-offensive. Lorraine, the Franco-German border. Just as dawn was breaking, the British Expeditionary Force, under Haig's command, launched an attack on the German lines in the drizzle. The attack, as usual, began after half an hour of artillery preparation. Unlike before, this time Monty had urgently purchased a batch of mortars, submachine guns, and shotguns from France. He planned to emulate Charles's trench warfare tactics, using mortars to suppress German fire from a distance, then throwing grenades at close range, and finally using submachine guns and shotguns to seize the enemy trenches. Anything that leads to victory is a good method, Monty told himself. Nobody cares whose tactics I use, but Monty knew that wasn't the case. Haig was averse to hearing about Charles or Charles's tactics. However, compared to victory and survival, it was insignificant. At worst, they could be repackaged as modified British tactics. 50-odd tanks, carrying over 10,000 soldiers, surged towards the German lines. Monty observed the enemy positions through the smoke in his binoculars. He had to succeed, Monty told himself. If he couldn't break through this time, he couldn't think of any other way. What Monty didn't notice was that the German lines had changed overnight. Dozens of roads had been created by filing in the 21-meter wide anti-tank ditch in front of the lines. A number of British tank wrecks had been hauled away, the shell craters in the no-man's land had been filled in, and the barbed wire had actually decreased instead of increased. Meanwhile, the Germans, who should have been bombarding the charging British troops with shells, were now eerily quiet. Monty sensed something was wrong. He put away his binoculars, frowned, and muttered to himself, "What the hell?" His staff officer beside him said, "Perhaps the Germans are running out of ammunition." "This is our chance, Major." It was indeed possible. The Germans were facing a shortage of supplies. But then Monty thought it unlikely. This was the first attack of the day. After a night of transport, the Germans should have managed to get a batch of ammunition. If not that, then what was it? Suddenly, a flicker of fear crossed Monty's eyes. He remembered Charles's warning, the Germans were about to attack. If it wasn't a lack of ammunition, there was only one reason the Germans were unwilling to fire. They were worried that shells would damage the ground and hinder the tank's advance. "Oh no," Monty exclaimed, "the Germans are attacking. Immediately switch the troops to defense, Major." The staff officer looked at Monty in astonishment. The troops had already entered no man's land. How could they switch to defense? "Go," Monty shouted, "everyone to defense." "Withdraw the troops." "Yes, Major," the staff officer replied. However, the staff officer had barely turned around when he saw 3 red signal flares fired from the German direction. Then, The rumble of engines suddenly filled the German lines, and tanks, carrying soldiers, emerged to meet the advancing British troops. The attacking British soldiers were instantly stunned. Their minds were focused on how to get close to the trenches and charge, never expecting to face German tanks. Leading the charge were uniformly Upper Silesia medium tanks, followed soon by several more enormous vehicles. Their flattened hulls lacked turrets, and they were several times the size of the new British tanks, with dark gun barrels and cannons protruding from their sides, like a hedgehog with its spikes raised. "What are those?" the British soldiers cried out in alarm. "It's the Germans' new tanks." God, Charles was right, the Germans are indeed planning an attack, we're doomed. Why wouldn't they listen to Charles's advice? Those bastards, they've killed us. Caught completely off guard, the British Army's psychological defenses crumbled the moment they faced the new German tanks. The tanks were the first to flee. Several Independence tanks turned around recklessly, accelerating even as their tracks crushed friendly forces. People face two extreme reactions when facing death. One is to calmly face death and persevere to the end, the other is to only think about survival, caring nothing for anything else. The British tanks exhibited both. But the tanks that remained to fight were quickly destroyed one after another by German anti-tank guns. During their battle with Charles, the Germans had developed a tactic of infantry anti-tank guns coordinating with tanks to destroy enemy tanks. Then, the German tanks, like tigers among sheep, led their infantry into the British ranks. At this moment, the British Army completely collapsed, turning from observation to total rout. Chapter 793 The time for acquisition has arrived. Half the reason for the British Army's rapid rout was Charles's warning. Charles accurately predicted the German movements, but the British commander-in-chief, Haig, ignored it. Therefore, when the German offensive became a reality, the last vestiges of trust and hope the British officers and soldiers had in their commander-in-chief vanished. Without faith in their commander and his command abilities, morale was naturally low. This left the British Expeditionary Force in a near one-sided situation in the ensuing defensive battles, routed like sheep by the Germans. The other half of the reason was the timely deployment of the K-Wagen Super Heavy tank by the Germans. This tank was intimidating in appearance only, it offered no advantage in tank warfare, with a top speed of only 7.5 km per hour. This speed was only slightly faster than walking. Its actual speed was much slower than walking because its weight and massive size caused it to constantly suffer from various problems along the way, requiring continuous maintenance and even track replacements every other day to prevent breakage. However, its imposing appearance when it appeared in the British ranks and stormed into their ranks terrified the British. Against infantry, it was like a mobile powder keg, with 4 77mm infantry guns and 7 Maxim machine guns. The overwhelming firepower was like a hurricane on the battlefield, bullets spraying wildly in all directions, shells relentlessly pursuing fleeing British tanks, displaying an indomitable spirit. The British had never seen such a war machine, and out of fear of the unknown equipment coupled with a sense of self-preservation and pride, they exaggerated its firepower and power to their allies after retreating, causing a chain reaction and panic among British troops in the rear. As a result, before the German army even reached the city walls, large numbers of British soldiers had already deserted. At the Pittsburgh training base, Charles was discussing reconnaissance methods for the truck-mounted artillery with Tigny. All the other problems with the truck-mounted artillery had been solved, but the reconnaissance method was giving Tigny a major headache. The characteristic of truck-mounted artillery is its rapid attack and withdrawal, Tigny explained, holding exercise data in one hand and a pencil in the other, drawing lines as he went. "We've tested it. It can withdraw to a safe area in about 5 minutes, which means this type of artillery is practically invincible, from target acquisition to calculating parameters and finally firing the shell into the target area. The enemy needs at least 5 minutes. Note, ordinary artillery takes more than 10 minutes to withdraw. In extreme cases, enemy shells often arrive before the artillery has even left the position. Truck-mounted artillery, in principle, only needs to retract its spade to complete the transition from combat to march, taking only about a minute, but the problem is, Tigny drew a horizontal line on the diagram with his pencil. Its range is over 10 kilometers, which means its targets are often enemy artillery units over 10 kilometers away, and our artillery observers deployed in the forward positions usually cannot observe these long-range targets. Char understood Tigny's meaning. The enemy's firepower deployment, from front to back, is usually no man's land, enemy lines, 77mm infantry guns, and then the long-range 105mm howitzers. Even with numerous artillery observers deployed forward, they were typically 7 or 8 kilometers away from the enemy's 105mm howitzer positions. More importantly, enemy artillery positions were often well hidden, sometimes even in blind spots, making them difficult to locate and calculate. Without the data, even the ability of truck-mounted artillery to fire and withdraw quickly was useless. Aircraft can locate enemy artillery positions, Charles said, as long as the enemy artillery fires. Firing would release a large amount of smoke, easily observable from the air. Tycoon shook his head helplessly. Even if they can observe them, it's useless, General. Aircraft need to transmit positions via message bottles, a method that is time-consuming and unreliable, and it's impossible to guide artillery fire accurately into the target area. Charles considered for a moment. I'll handle it, leave it to me. You can handle it. Tycoon didn't believe it. What solution could there be? We just need to bring the radios on the planes, Major General, Charles replied. We have bombers and air superiority. The only problem was that radios were prone to malfunction during flight, so the bombers were required to maintain stable flight throughout the entire flight. Tycoon was stunned by Charles's statement, stammering, "Take the radio on the plane? Is it really possible?" Of course, Charles nodded firmly. At this time, radios were impractical for inter-aircraft communication due to their large size and susceptibility to malfunction. However, this didn't mean they couldn't be used on bombers for air-to-ground communication. Of course, this required fighter escort to ensure its safety. Otherwise, bombers, maintaining low speed and stable flight, would be highly vulnerable to enemy attacks. Fantastic, General. Tycoon excitedly shook Charles's shoulder. Do you know what this means? Our truck-mounted artillery will completely suppress German artillery, even if we only have 2 artillery regiments with 80-odd guns. Tycoon was right. Although Charles's truck-mounted artillery used the German 105mm howitzer, its performance was essentially identical. But in a contest between long-range artillery, the key was which side could pinpoint the enemy's location faster and more accurately, and then quickly withdraw after firing their shells. If Charles could achieve coordination between aerial reconnaissance and truck-mounted artillery, then artillery warfare in this era would be like having a cheat code, virtually invincible. And this was just the beginning. Later, aerial reconnaissance aircraft could also provide data for other infantry artillery, a qualitative leap in the overall combat effectiveness of the artillery, even though French artillery was inferior to German artillery. At this moment, a staff officer handed over a telegram. Tycoon glanced at it, looking at Charles with admiration. You guessed right again. The Germans launched a counter-offensive this morning, and the British Army has collapsed across the board. Charles took the telegram and looked at it. What interested him more was that the Germans had deployed a super-heavy tank. The K-Wagen? Good news. It perfectly confirmed what Charles had mentioned in Parliament not long ago. The Germans are developing a 150-ton super-heavy tank. Some members of Parliament still didn't believe it. Now the facts were before them, leaving them no choice but to believe. Meanwhile, the emergence of the German super-heavy tank and the British defeat would further exacerbate the panic among domestic capitalists. The war was unfolding exactly as Charles had predicted. The Germans were launching a dual offensive using super-heavy tanks and the Paris artillery, easily routing the British army of over 500,000. Therefore, the outcome was still uncertain, and Paris could fall again. Consequently, asset and land prices would plummet. Charles said nothing. He calmly returned to his lounge and sent telegrams via his private radio to Joka and Armand respectively. The time for acquisition has come. Chapter 794, Giving America a Slap in the Face. The British Expeditionary Force, pursued by the Germans for over 60 kilometers and suffering losses of over 200,000 men, finally found respite at the Nancy defenses of Army Group East. The Germans initially intended to press their advantage, but a few bombs dropped by Charles's bombers towards Metz halted their advance. Hindenburg seemed to realize this was a warning from Charles. Charles possessed belt pontoon bridges, capable of quickly erecting several pontoon bridges across the Meuse for the rapid crossing of armored units. This meant the entire German flank was exposed to Charles's attack. If Hindenburg didn't want to be caught in a two-front war, the best option was to withdraw while ahead. This was exactly what Charles wanted. He could let the British and Gamelin's Army Group East fight the Germans on the east bank of the Meuse while he watched from the sidelines. To be precise, it wasn't just watching from the sidelines. Charles had profited immensely from the German counter-offensive in the past few days. Farmland was acquired at $60 to $70 per hectare, roughly 1/7 to 1/9 of the original price. Ranches and construction land were acquired at a fraction of the original price. Power plants, cement plants, steel mills, and other construction-related factories and companies were also sold at reduced prices. De Jocko even managed to acquire controlling stakes in 2 railway companies. The successful acquisition of railway companies was unexpected. They were scarce resources during wartime. Troop transport and supply lines relied heavily on railways, and their importance increased with the intensity of the fighting, driving up transportation costs. However, even the most important and expensive assets needed protection. The owners of these 2 railway companies were shrewd. They knew that the skies over France belonged to Charles, and whether certain areas could be defended or spared German bombing often depended on Charles's word or a single thought. Therefore, bringing Charles into their railway companies was a wise move. This can be seen as a siphoning effect. When Charles grew into a powerful force capable of sheltering other industries, they would actively seek his protection even if Charles didn't actively seek them out. At the training base in western Tibet, Charles took a moment to review the reports sent by Jocko. He was fairly satisfied with the first phase of the acquisition, but funds were dwindling. They had secured about 1/6 of the arable and construction land, roughly enough to meet France's needs. Charles didn't expect, nor did he need, to acquire 100%, or even half. Ensuring national security meant that, in extreme circumstances, the food grown on this land could guarantee that French citizens wouldn't starve. In peacetime, it meant that when capitalists attempted to hoard food and drive up prices, Charles could release food at low prices to suppress prices. This was the state's macroeconomic control of the market. However, in vital industries like power plants, communications, railways, and energy, Charles only controlled about 1/3 of the area around Paris. This was far from ensuring national security. At best, it only allowed him to control Paris. He needed much more funding, at least 2 to 3 times the current amount, to pose a threat to capitalists in various industries. Only then could he achieve control. Where to raise funds? Charles thought of the United States. Joseph's stockpiles of military supplies in the United States had reached a considerable scale, and the arsenal's production was stabilizing. It was time to liquidate them. In other words, it was time to put pressure on the United States. With this in mind, Charles sent a telegram to Clemenceau: "Your Excellency, given the current situation, France has essentially recovered its own territory, while Germany still possesses considerable strength. We cannot force its surrender in a short time. I believe that continuing this war will only increase casualties and serve little purpose. A wiser choice is to negotiate with Britain and actively seek a ceasefire with Germany. Our condition is that Germany return all our territories, including Lorraine and Alsace." Charles's telegram instantly caused a sensation in Paris. First, Clemenceau held a vote in Parliament, with a staggering 63% of members supporting negotiations with Germany. "If Germany is willing to return Lorraine and Alsace, our objective will be achieved. Yes, what more could we expect? This is the best outcome. Let the Germans cede territory? No, the Germans on those lands won't submit to a rule. It might be a losing proposition and ultimately lead to war." The news spread from Parliament to the people, and both the military and civilians supported making peace with the Germans. "We've had enough of this war. Charles is right. Continuing like this is pointless. I've even forgotten what we're fighting for. To stop the German invasion? We've already done that. Yes, return Lorraine and Alsace to us, and we can end this war with dignity." In London, the War Office building, as usual, was shrouded in fog. British Prime Minister Lloyd George reviewed documents in his office. Britain's advantage lay in being an island nation. The war was taking place in France, having little impact on British industry. If there was any impact, it was the shortage of manpower and the weakened global standing and control over colonies due to setbacks at the front. At that moment, First Lord of the Navy Balfour entered and handed George a telegram. "From France, Your Excellency the Prime Minister, they believe it is time to negotiate." George took the telegram, glanced at it, and set it aside. He preferred to continue the war. "Victory is within our grasp. Why not drive the Germans to their unconditional surrender?" he said. "That way, we can get huge reparations." Balfour reminded George, "Your Excellency, our army is in complete disarray at Metz. Even Charles is helpless against the Germans' Paris gun and new tanks. I believe Charles will ultimately achieve victory, but the cost could be extremely heavy. That may be why Charles proposed armistice negotiations. George remained non-committal. The Western Front is only one of the fronts that Germans face. They are already overwhelmed fighting on multiple fronts, but no sooner had he finished speaking than several battle reports arrived in quick succession. The Italian Third Army organized the Sixth Battle of the Isonzo, but due to lack of reserves, it failed to achieve a decisive breakthrough, and the battle ended. In the Romanian direction, the German Alpine Corps marched 80 kilometers at high speed in 3 days, defeating the Romanian army at Sibiu, capturing 25,000 Romanian soldiers, and forcing the Romanian army to retreat. On the Eastern Front, the German army launched a full-scale counter-offensive, and the Russian army is retreating. George felt the world had changed instantly. He had thought Germany was in defeat, but the truth was they were winning on all fronts. Your Excellency the Chancellor, Balfour added, the German fleet seems to be active at sea recently. Chapter 795 Battle of Jutland. At the Forgotten Palace in Berlin, the setting sun cast a long shadow. Wilhelm II, who hadn't rested since the previous night, remained excited, pacing back and forth in his study, glancing frequently at the telephone on his desk. He and Admiral Skier had decided to risk a breakout operation against the British Navy. They both knew that the German Navy was no match for the Royal Navy in either tonnage or quality. Therefore, the plan was to send a small fleet to provoke the British, luring a portion of the British fleet forward, then concentrate the main German fleet to encircle and annihilate them. With a few more victories like this, the German Navy would gradually catch up with the Royal Navy, eventually engaging them in a decisive battle and utterly defeating them. This was the only chance, Wilhelm II thought. He had already lost control of the army. If the Navy couldn't achieve a victory or break through, he too would become an emperor in name only, like the German fleet. Suddenly, the telephone rang. Wilhelm II abruptly grabbed the receiver. It was the staff officer's voice. Your Majesty, we have achieved victory on the Western Front. Field Marshal Hindenburg's troops have reached the enemy's Nancy defenses. Oh, really? Wilhelm II looked disappointed. Well, that's good. Congratulate the Field Marshal and all the soldiers involved in the attack. After hanging up, Wilhelm II frowned. What was wrong with Charles? When Falkenhayn was chief of the General Staff, he was invincible. But with Hindenburg as chief of the General Staff, he remained inactive on the west bank of the Meuse. Wilhelm II sighed deeply. This was not a good thing. The more victories Hindenburg won, the more secure his prestige and position would be, and the more of a figurehead he, the emperor, would become. The phone rang again. Wilhelm II picked up the receiver dejectedly and said weakly, "It's me, Your Majesty, we have won," came General Skier's excited voice from the other end of the line. Wilhelm II's face instantly lit up with delight. Really? A victory? What kind of victory? Tell me, in detail. Wilhelm II didn't want to hear the result all at once. He preferred to know the whole process, like savoring a delicious meal, little by little, step by step. That was a kind of enjoyment. Admiral Skier replied, "This naval battle was unexpected. We encountered the main British fleet in the Jutland Sea. They deployed at least 150 warships. My God." Wilhelm II's face turned pale with fright. 150 warships. That's almost twice the number of our warships. Actually, it wasn't twice. The German Navy deployed 99 ships, but the difference was significant enough. Yes, Admiral Skier spoke quickly, seemingly still caught up in the tension and excitement of the battle. I once thought we were doomed. The enemy had overwhelming us on all fronts. Their fleet stretched for 10 kilometers. We originally intended to use superior forces to encircle their small fleet, but instead, we were surrounded. It was a major surprise attack. Wilhelm II asked nervously, and then? How many did we lose? We lost 4 light cruisers and 5 torpedo boats, Your Majesty, Admiral Skier replied. In addition, 1 battle cruiser and 1 dreadnought were heavily damaged, and 9 cruisers were lightly damaged, but they all returned safely and only need some time to repair. Note, German torpedo boats were actually destroyers. The terminology differed during World War I. Wilhelm II gave a no, unable to hide his disappointment. Admiral Skier likely considered breaking out of the enemy's encirclement a victory. While it was indeed a victory, it wasn't the kind of victory Wilhelm II desired. Unexpectedly, Admiral Skier continued, we sank a total of 3 British battlecruisers, 3 armored cruisers, and 8 torpedo boats. What? Wilhelm II's eyes widened. What did you say? Yes, Your Majesty, Admiral Skier replied excitedly. You heard me right. We sank a total of 14 enemy ships, including 3 battlecruisers. Wilhelm I stared blankly for a long while, then exclaimed excitedly, "Fantastic! Admiral, I knew it. I knew we could win. We have the world's most powerful navy, the best sailors, the best commanders." "No, Your Majesty," Admiral Skier interrupted Wilhelm I. "This is all thanks to Charles." "What?" Wilhelm I didn't understand. Admiral Skier explained, "Oh, what seaplanes, Your Majesty, you didn't see the naval battle. Our seaplanes, in conjunction with torpedo boats, launched a combined attack on the enemy fleet, catching them completely off guard. I mean, when enemy ships turned to evade our torpedoes, our seaplanes seized the opportunity to attack. The enemy ships were caught off guard. They either stood motionless like targets or were thrown into chaos. Several of our warships were sunk, including 2 battlecruisers, and we severely damaged another." This was a tactic Admiral Skier had painstakingly developed. At the start of the battle, he discovered that over 100 British warships were lined up in a T formation, blocking the German fleet's advance. If the German fleet forced its way through, it would be met with concentrated fire from the British fleet. The German fleet, disadvantaged in both numbers and formation, was destined for a crushing defeat. Therefore, Admiral Skier withdrew his main fleet and instead used torpedo boat groups to launch torpedo attacks. Note, the British fleet, positioned in a favorable T formation, was easily hit by torpedoes, even if the torpedo boats launched indiscriminately without a target, because the British warships were positioned but astern with the German fleet facing outwards, maximizing their lateral surface area. To avoid the torpedoes, the British fleet changed course, facing the German torpedo boats bow to bow. At that moment, German seaplanes, carrying torpedoes, swooped down from the clouds, attacking the British fleet's flanks. A total of 35 aircraft were deployed. Admiral Skier used all available seaplanes, one of which failed to take off due to malfunction. They hardly needed to aim, as there were over 100 warships below. Torpedoes were dropped at close range, leaving white trails as they hurtled towards the warships. The British fleet was thrown into chaos. They hastily turned to avoid the torpedoes from the planes, only to be hit by torpedoes launched from another direction. Some chose not to evade, but became easy targets for the planes. At this moment, the main German naval force turned back and launched a fierce attack on the British fleet. After hearing the entire account, Wilhelm I was overjoyed. "Unbelievable. We actually defeated the main British fleet, defeated it head-on, just because of the support of torpedo planes. If that's the case, does it mean we now possess the capability to break through the British fleet's blockade?" If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 796, Breaking the Blockade. At the training base in western Tibet, Tijani ate dry bread with coffee for breakfast. He was very dedicated to training the motorized infantry, even more so than he had been to training the mechanized infantry. Shah was puzzled, but Tijani's answer was convincing. "The motorized infantry is the only unit with long-range artillery, General," Tijani replied. "Look at our armored and mechanized units, they're mostly equipped with 75mm cannons. But the motorized infantry's artillery has developed inter-ground coordination. I believe this artillery can play an unexpected role on the battlefield." This made sense. In the future, armored and mechanized units would also develop long-range artillery, and might even replace it with more expensive, better protected, and faster-firing self-propelled howitzers. But at this stage, the enemy's infantry-artillery coordination and artillery accuracy were problematic, so developing to that level wasn't really necessary. If all else failed, borrowing the 105mm truck-mounted guns from the motorized units would suffice. "Look at this." Tijani swallowed his bread with difficulty and handed Shah the day's newspaper. The Germans and British fought a battle at sea. Tijani took a sip of his coffee, finally easing the dryness in his throat. "Interestingly, both sides claim victory." Charles hummed in agreement and took the newspaper to browse the battle report. "But what they say seems to make sense," Tijani continued. "The Germans achieved a tactical victory. They traded 4 light cruisers and 5 destroyers for 14 British warships, including 3 battlecruisers. In the era of battleships, naval battles were more about the number and losses of battleships. Other warships were merely supplementary. Therefore, Germany won this naval battle with a casualty ratio of 0, 3. Tycoon sat back down, a hint of regret in his voice, and the British, they achieved a strategic victory. They successfully blocked the German fleet's breakout. Charles chuckled softly. Is that what you think? Tycoon, who was about to review a stack of documents, paused, looking up at Charles. Isn't that right? Charles waved the newspaper in his hand. The Germans, like us, successfully mounted torpedoes on aircraft, a rear admiral, and seaplanes at that. Do you know what that means? Tycoon looked blank, but they only had about 30 of them, not a significant force. The key point is that these planes could easily sink battleships, Charles replied. Torpedo bomber attacks were indeed difficult, even demanding, requiring things like maintaining stable flight and not going too fast. If the enemy warships had adequate anti-aircraft firepower, the torpedo bombers would most likely be shot down during the attack. However, this was World War I, and torpedo bombers had only recently been invented. The British Navy hadn't realized the importance of naval anti-aircraft defense, nor did it possess suitable anti-aircraft firepower. Therefore, torpedo bombers were virtually invincible at sea. Tycoon suddenly realized, you mean, the Germans can break through the British fleet's blockade using seaplanes? Charles nodded slightly. The very reason he had shown the torpedo bombers to the Germans was this, to allow the German fleet to break through the Royal Navy's blockade and thus purchase supplies from the neutral Nordic countries. However, the Germans hadn't yet discovered this. At this moment, a communications officer stepped forward with a telegram reporting, General, there's new information about the naval battle. German seaplanes have sunk 3 more warships near Bergen, Norway, including a battleship. Tycoon stared at Charles with his mouth slightly agape. This guy seemed to have a precognitive ability. Charles secretly praised Admiral Scheer of the German Navy for his quick comprehension, grasping the key point in a short time. This was the result of Admiral Scheer's agonizing night of thought. Because the German Navy was far outnumbered by the Royal Navy, Admiral Scheer, having achieved his initial success, immediately withdrew the fleet back to Hamburg. Hamburg had always been Germany's largest naval repair base, where damaged ships could be quickly restored to combat readiness. Admiral Scheer did this to prepare for the next offensive. However, Admiral Scheer was not satisfied with this, nor with the original attrition strategy. Luck still played a part in today's victory. If the British fleet had not retreated but had engaged the German fleet in a disparate decisive battle, the German fleet might still have been annihilated due to its numerical superiority. Germany needed supplies and trade with the neutral Nordic countries. A victory without breaking the blockade was ultimately not a victory. What could change this? Suddenly, a bold idea formed in Admiral Scheer's mind. Seaplanes. Why not use seaplanes to break the blockade? Admiral Scheer jumped up from his chair excitedly. Yes, that's exactly what Scheer wanted to tell us. This guy, he's done us a huge favor. The image above shows the shipping route from Hamburg to Bergen, a major Norwegian port. This route is far from the British mainland, outside the range of the British Camel fighter planes. Therefore, the German U-boats, equipped with torpedoes, were virtually invincible and could freely attack any British fleet appearing in the nearby waters. The 2 red circles in the image above represent the Orkney and Shetland Islands, where Britain had ports. Its main fleet used these ports as bases to blockade the German Navy, with Bergen, Norway, as the primary target. Admiral Scheer, filled with excitement, reported his battle plan to Wilhelm II. We were so stupid, Your Majesty, we were like an immature child. Scheer had already given us the answer, we just didn't know how to use it. Breaking the blockade with aircraft doesn't require destroying the British fleet like the Navy does, we just need to drive them away. Wilhelm II didn't understand. Drive them away? Even if it's about driving them away, we have to defeat them at sea, don't we? This was the ingrained thinking from years of naval warfare without aircraft. Wilhelm II always believed that only a fleet could drive away an enemy fleet. What could 36 seaplanes do? They could only carry 36 torpedoes each time. No, Your Majesty, Admiral Scheer replied, his usually calm voice trembling, airplanes are enough. Although they can only carry 36 torpedoes, as long as they patrol in the air, the British fleet won't dare approach. Wilhelm II suddenly realized, and after a moment of stunned silence, he burst into laughter. That's right, General, a brilliant idea. As long as the enemy fleet gets close, they will inevitably be attacked by aircraft, perhaps not many, but very dangerous. Therefore, they can only avoid us, they can only be driven away by us. God, I never thought the answer to breaking the blockade would be so simple. Chapter 797 Flight Route Safety. The actual combat results exceeded Admiral Skier's expectations. Admiral Skier's operational plan was very detailed. The distance from Hamburg to Bergen is 800 kilometers, precisely the range that the Ullrich seaplanes, equipped with external fuel tanks, could cover. A round trip was clearly impossible, let alone patrolling the target area. However, the Ullrich was a seaplane. The advantage of seaplanes is that they can land on the sea, refuel via warships or even submarines, and, if necessary, be used to carry torpedoes or replace pilots via supply ships. This solved the problems of insufficient range and payload. Admiral Skier even considered the difficulty of recovering and repairing these seaplanes if they malfunctioned during high-intensity missions. Therefore, replacement parts and maintenance personnel were prepared on supply submarines for repair and maintenance at sea. The biggest challenge was the North Sea conditions. If the waves were too high for the seaplanes to land for refueling, returning to Germany without fuel would be almost impossible. But Admiral Skier, eager to break the blockade, disregarded these concerns and dispatched the seaplanes overnight. The next day, just as dawn was breaking, an unsuspecting British fleet was attacked by torpedoes from seaplanes. The seaplanes launched 23 torpedoes, sinking 1 battleship and 2 destroyers. Cheers of victory instantly echoed through Admiral Skier's command post and Wilhelm II's study. Wilhelm II was even moved to tears, not only because he hoped to regain power, but also because Germany had finally broken through the blockade of the Royal Navy. He closed his eyes slightly, gently made the sign of the cross, and said in a slightly choked voice, "Mother, I did it, but you won't be proud of it, will you?" Note, Wilhelm II's mother, Queen Mary, was a British princess. From Wilhelm II's childhood, Queen Mary had always taught him that the Royal Navy was invincible and that he should not try to challenge it but should submit. The news of the German Navy breaking the blockade in the North Sea caused a sensation throughout the Allied powers, like a bombshell. The French didn't seem to care much about this. To them, the German Navy was a matter on the other side of the Channel, a contest between Britain and Germany. France only needed Charles. Their primary concern was winning the land war. Therefore, the newspapers published some lukewarm expressions of concern. The Germans' breakthrough of the North Sea blockade has given them access to the resources of Northern Europe. This will undoubtedly ease tensions at home. This also proves Charles's assessment correct. There is no need for us to continue this war, and we should begin armistice negotiations with Germany as soon as possible. The British media erupted in chaos. The Times almost described the war as Britain's doom. Our army has performed so poorly on the battlefield that the only thing upholding our great power beliefs is the Royal Navy. It is the world's most powerful navy, yet it cannot even blockade a port or a shipping route. More importantly, the mode of naval warfare seems to have undergone a radical change. It is no longer decided by warships as before, but by airplanes, which are much cheaper than battleships but can decide their fate. The Guardian's report was equally pessimistic. We have always felt safe because Britain is an island nation, surrounded by sea, in principle. As long as we have the most powerful fleet, no one can threaten the British mainland, but the facts tell us otherwise. If the Germans can use airplanes to repel our powerful fleet, does that mean they can also open our ports and land directly? Even more so, these planes can drop bombs directly on our heads. In the War Office building in London, the Secretary of Munitions, with a cigar in his mouth, frowned as he looked at the war report from the North Sea through the smoke. General Winter walked up to him and stood at attention, saluting. The quartermaster grunted and slowly pushed the battle report towards General Winter. "You know about this, don't you?" "Yes, Your Excellency," General Winter replied. "Although this is a naval matter," the quartermaster said, "it also concerns my duties, I mean, munitions. I want to know if my transport routes are safe." "Of course, Your Excellency," General Winter said confidently, "the Germans have found a loophole. Our camel fighters don't have enough range to escort over Bergen, but it's different elsewhere." The quartermaster was slightly relieved. "So, what the newspapers say isn't true." "Of course," General Winter explained, "the Germans couldn't possibly use such aircraft to attack the main island. Our camel fighters will shoot them down before they reach the coastline, and they will also protect our transport routes." The quartermaster said nothing, his face contorted with anger as he stared coldly at General Winter. General Winter seemed to understand the quartermaster's meaning. "Yes, Your Excellency. Given the remarkable effectiveness of torpedo bombers, we are already developing this aircraft." "You must understand, General," the quartermaster said, removing his cigar from his mouth. "Can you answer a few questions for me?" "Of course, Your Excellency." The quartermaster nodded slightly. "How many camel fighters do we have in total? How many airfields and how much fuel do these camel fighters need to ensure our air routes are not attacked by the enemy?" General Winter was stunned. The quartermaster had hit the nail on the head. Britain currently only had about 50 camel fighters, all deployed to the Western Front for air superiority, with only a few remaining domestically for training and instruction. Note: modern aircraft have dedicated trainer aircraft. During World War I, airplanes were newly invented and the concept of trainer aircraft didn't exist, so fighter planes were used instead, and the North Sea alone had nearly 1,000 kilometers of air routes potentially vulnerable to German attack. How could a handful of camel fighters guarantee the safety of these routes? "Do I need to remind you," the quartermaster continued, "our merchant ships are carrying tens of thousands of tons of supplies. Just one torpedo, just one, can send them all to the bottom of the sea." "I understand, Your Excellency," General Winter said, blushing. I will have them speed up the production of fighter jets." The quartermaster shook his head slightly. "No, General, that's not what you need. You need to go to Paris and see Charles." "Charles?" "Yes," the quartermaster replied. "I heard he's producing a warship equipped with a new type of anti-aircraft machine gun. That's what we need, understand?" General Winter suddenly realized. "Yes, Your Excellency." Chapter 798 Zimmermann Telegram. 1916 was an election year in the United States. President Wilson was in his office, handling official business while simultaneously working with his campaign team to prepare for the election 4 months later. "How is it going?" Wilson asked his campaign aide. "Hughes's poll numbers are up," the aide said, his voice tinged with worry. "His arguments seem to be gaining popularity. He thinks we've been too weak in dealing with the German submarine war, and you're making America look vulnerable." Wilson didn't stop working, simply grunting in agreement. Hughes was a shrewd and formidable opponent, and the polls had remained neck and neck. Hughes, in the opposition, had a natural advantage. He could criticize Wilson for what he had done poorly or insufficiently over the past 4 years, and he could compensate for those shortcomings. One of these was Hughes's belief that even with American neutrality, preparations for war should be made actively, and that a firm stance should be taken on the German submarine blockade. Wilson continued signing documents, casually asking, "Do you think his rise in the polls is accidental or due to other reasons?" "It's probably related to the recent setbacks on the European front," the aide replied. Wilson paused, looking at his assistant with a puzzled expression. "The battlefield is unfavorable, yet people are choosing to support Hughes. Shouldn't they be staying away from the war?" "Yes," the assistant handed him the poll results, explaining, "because the battlefield is unfavorable, people believe that participation in the war may be inevitable, and therefore they are more inclined to support Hughes's war preparation ideas." Wilson fell silent. His campaign slogan was "Wilson saves America from war," which exploited voters' fear of war and desire for peace. Unexpectedly, the voters had shown a subtle shift at this point. "It's not just lower and middle-class voters, Your Excellency," the assistant added. "Many politicians and capitalists also intend to go to war." Wilson grunted in agreement. This was undeniable. Politicians and capitalists wanted to prevent Britain's $10 billion loan from becoming a bad debt. Therefore, when Charles proposed negotiations for peace, they panicked. "The war must continue, otherwise we will all go bankrupt because we can't recover our loans." "Yes, until the Germans completely surrender and pay reparations, $10 billion, no one can afford such a price." In fact, Wilson believed this was the main reason. Because these capitalists control the media and public opinion, and use them to subtly manipulate the will of the people. Capitalists are very good at this. Wilson sensed danger. If he didn't make changes, he might lose to his opponents. But how should he change? From staying away from war to actively preparing for war? This would not only be seen as opportunistic, but also as following Hughes and being criticized for lacking independent judgment. Just as Wilson was hesitating, a staff officer delivered a telegram. "Your Excellency, a secret telegram has arrived from Paris." Paris? Wilson was puzzled. Because of their shared ethnicity, or perhaps because Britain was the world's leading power, the United States tacitly accepted that Britain would lead the Western Front, and therefore engaged more with Britain than with France. Now, however, a secret telegram had arrived from Paris. And in the presidential office. A telegram that could be called secret was top secret, Something even the staff officer had no right to see. What could it be? With these questions in mind, Wilson opened the envelope, took out the telegram, and was instantly dumbfounded after glancing at it. It was a coded telegram from Germany to Mexico intercepted by French intelligence. The deciphered message revealed that Germany was attempting to cooperate with Mexico to tie down the United States. We will do our utmost to keep the United States neutral. If this plan fails, we propose an alliance with Mexico and joint operations on the following basis. We will provide your country with substantial financial assistance, and Mexico will reclaim the lost territories of New Mexico, Texas, and Arizona. Germany guarantees to recognize your sovereignty over these territories. Note, these three states comprised 2.4 million square kilometers of territory annexed by the United States during the Mexican-American War from 1846 to 1848. The telegram is authentic and, because it was sent by German Foreign Secretary Zimmermann, it is known as the Zimmermann telegram, considered the catalyst for American entry into the war. Wilson jumped up from his chair, realizing this was a golden opportunity, a smooth chance to change his political views and even get ahead of his opponents. Give this telegram to the newspaper. Wilson handed the telegram to his assistant and ordered, publish it word for word. The assistant took the telegram, glanced at it, and his face instantly changed. The Germans were actually extending their reach into the Americas, even forming an alliance with Mexico in an attempt to annex American territory. War was inevitable. Sure enough, the telegram's contents, once published in the newspapers, instantly ignited the anger of the American public. We have always maintained neutrality and restraint. Even though Americans have lost their lives at the hands of German submarines, this has not stopped the Germans from bringing the war to the United States. Is this what they want? To provoke a war between Mexico and us, so that the United States will be preoccupied with other matters. This is a provocation against us. We cannot ignore it. We must teach them a lesson. The reason the American public remained neutral was largely due to the Monroe Doctrine. The United States would remain neutral as long as war did not occur in the Americas. Otherwise, the United States would consider it an act of hostility. Although war had not yet broken out, the secret alliance between Germany and Mexico was a blatant act of hostility, which the United States could not tolerate. At this moment, Wilson seized the opportunity to appeal to everyone. Gentlemen, it has been proven that appeasement alone cannot bring peace. The world must be safe and democratic. Rights are more precious than peace. We will fight for our interests. We have no selfish purposes or pursuits. We do not want to conquer others. We do not seek reparations for ourselves, and we do not seek material compensation for our voluntary sacrifices. We fight only for great moral principles. This struggle is not only against Germany, but also against all despotic politics. The anger of the American people was ignited, and they responded to Wilson's call. We should wage a war to end the war. The Germans are fighting against all of humanity. We must stand with the Allies to protect human civilization. Arm yourselves. There should be no more restrictions. Far across the Atlantic, Wilhelm II probably never imagined that his seemingly clever move would drag the world's leading industrial power into war. However, he should have realized that American entry into the war was predetermined the moment Charles proposed armistice negotiations with Germany. American capitalists would not allow the war to end through negotiations. This telegram merely provided the United States with a perfect excuse. Chapter 799 U.S. Army Mobilization. Wilson did not immediately declare war on Germany. He chose to let the dust settle. This was his brilliance. He waited until the public and members of Congress generally supported entering the war before making a decision, which was safer and more likely to gain popular support. His opponent, Hughes, had only one choice: follow Wilson and support the war. At that point, Hughes would become a hapless follower, and to make the most of every resource, he should have abandoned his candidacy and united with President Wilson. Whichever he chose, Hughes would be in a passive position. War mobilization began immediately. Before mobilization, the U.S. Army had fewer than 300,000 personnel, and the Air Force was particularly weak, with only 150 pilots and a mere 50 outdated fighter planes. The image above shows a JN-4 aircraft used by the U.S. Air Force before the war, manufactured by Curtiss. It cost only $300, was unarmed, and due to its outdated nature, was only used for reconnaissance without air combat. However, it was mass-produced, with 6,813 aircraft produced in just over a year for pilot training. President Wilson, a university professor, lacked military expertise, So he immediately sought out Brigadier General Pershing, then commander of the Mexican Expeditionary Force. The image above shows Pershing, then a major in 1906, who was promoted 3 ranks to become the youngest brigadier general due to President Roosevelt's appreciation. Wilson's first question to Pershing was, "General, how many troops do you think we need to recruit?" Pershing stepped forward and countered, "What do you mean, Your Excellency? Defeat the Germans or make them surrender?" President Wilson asked doubtfully, "Is there a difference?" "Of course," Pershing said meaningfully, "defeat the Germans doesn't require us, Charles is enough. But, making them surrender," Pershing stopped abruptly, a hint of sarcasm on his face. "Isn't the difference obvious? What are the American troops fighting for?" President Wilson was somewhat embarrassed. He cleared his throat and forced himself to stand straight before Pershing. As a politician, he knew that the more insecure he felt, the more confident he had to appear. "Of course, it's to make the Germans surrender completely, General," Wilson said. "We have no choice but to fight. They shouldn't have laid their hands on Mexico." "Yes, Your Excellency," Pershing nodded. "I completely agree," but the look in his eyes as he looked at Wilson said something else entirely. Pershing agreed to participate in the war, but his goal wasn't reparations, it was to get the American troops to catch up with the European powers. Otherwise, the United States, lacking tactical knowledge and severely outdated equipment, might very well become their prey. Wilson pretended not to see the disdain in Pershing's eyes and shook his hand without changing his expression. "Very good, we've reached an agreement. So, back to the previous question, how many people do we need to recruit?" Pershing hesitated slightly. "I think we need to recruit all young people aged 21 to 31. Wilson's expression changed slightly. "Are you crazy? That could be 2 million people," Pershing hummed in surprise. "Only 2 million? Then we need to consider expanding the age range. How about 18 to 45? Can we recruit 5 million people, you mean?" Wilson was shocked by this number. "You mean, we need to invest another 5 million people to have any chance of winning?" Pershing nodded calmly. "Perhaps, Your Excellency," Pershing analyzed methodically. "Look at the Western Front now. The Anglo-French forces have over 3 million men, but they've only managed to contain the Germans east of the Meuse River. On the Eastern Front, the Russian army has mobilized over 10 million soldiers so far. Although many have deserted, there are still around 6 million on the front lines." Pershing then slowed his pace, speaking slowly and deliberately, "And now, the Eastern Front is teetering on the brink of collapse. Once it falls, how many men do you think we'll need to fill the gap?" Wilson was stunned. He only wanted to join the war, only wanted to boost public opinion and recoup the loan, but he had never seriously calculated how many troops were needed. Now, after Pershing's words, he realized this could be a disaster. Pershing added, "Perhaps I should remind you that, according to inaccurate statistics, the Anglo-French forces have suffered over 3 million casualties. Knowing this, do you still think 5 million is a lot?" Wilson was speechless. The American army, in terms of tactics, equipment, and experience, was no match for the Anglo-French forces. So, Pershing was right. If the Anglo-French forces needed 3 million, the American forces might need to use all 5 million. After a long pause, Wilson said with difficulty, "All right, we will recruit 1 million soldiers first. You will become the commander-in-chief of the expeditionary force. General, be prepared, take them to Dunkirk and report to General Kitchener." Pershing didn't answer, just stared blankly at Wilson. "Is there a problem?" Wilson asked. "Can I take back what I just said?" Pershing said. "What? We don't need 5 million, we need 10 million, Pershing replied. Wilson was furious. "What makes you think that? Can you decide the life and death of 5 million people just because of your own idea? Those are the lives of countless young men." "No, it's not just my idea, Your Excellency," Pershing replied calmly, "but yours." Wilson tilted his head, not understanding what Pershing meant. Pershing revealed the answer, "If you let me report to Kitchener and take his command, even 10 million might not be enough." Wilson suddenly realized, "You want to fight independently? But we have no experience fighting on the Western Front, and the vast majority of us are new recruits. I would be happy to fight under Charles's command." Pershing interrupted Wilson, "If we had Charles's equipment, we might only need 1 million men." Wilson laughed, "Are you joking? 10 million for Kitchener's command, only 1 million for Charles's, a tenfold difference?" "I never joke, Your Excellency," Pershing stood up and replied, "I'm serious." Wilson shook his head, he still couldn't believe there could be such a huge difference. You should fight under the unified command of the British Army, Wilson insisted. It's an alliance, General. You should know the importance of unity. Without acknowledging British command, the troops on the Western Front would likely fragment and fight independently. All right, Pershing said with a hint of helplessness, as you wish, but I hope I can have some autonomy. Of course, you'll. Wilson nodded confidently. A significant portion of the supplies provided by Britain and France came from the United States, and for that reason alone, the opinions of the U.S. military should be given sufficient respect. Chapter 800, Forcing the United States to Enter the War. Appointed commander of the American Expeditionary Force, Pershing had many tasks to complete, such as organizing recruitment, developing training plans for the troops, and assigning instructors. He should have stayed in the United States with his troops. However, Pershing flew to New York with his Chief of Staff, Hubbard, immediately after leaving the White House. The image above shows Brigadier General James Hubbard, Pershing's right-hand man during World War I. He was responsible for the daily organization and logistical coordination of the Expeditionary Force. In the early stages of World War I, the U.S. military did not have helmets, and officers often wore French or British helmets. Hubbard wore a French Adrian helmet. Some American officers did this, removing the insignia from their Adrian helmets and writing U.S. on them. The plane landed at the New York airport, and Pershing immediately jumped into the car that was already waiting there. Hubbard finally couldn't hold back and asked Pershing, "Where are we going, General?" Pershing casually replied, "France." Caught completely off guard, Hubbard's mouth dropped open in surprise, and it took him a moment to process it. "France? But, I don't think this is the right time, General. You should stay in America, with your troops." Hubbard panicked. The Expeditionary Force needed Pershing as commander to oversee the overall situation, yet he had abandoned his troops and headed to France with only a few men. Pershing turned aside to avoid the wind blowing through the car window, slowly lit a cigarette, and casually offered one to Hubbard. After exhaling a long puff of smoke, he asked, "What can I do here?" "There are many things, General," Hubbard said, puzzled. "Mainly training, is that so?" Pershing turned to look at Hubbard. "All our war experience comes from the Indian Wars, from San Juan Hill, or from dealing with guerrillas in Mexico. Do you know how to train troops?" "I mean, against the Germans." Hubbard was stunned. None of them knew how to fight this battle, let alone how to train. "Our training is likely wrong, James." Pershing nodded slightly to Hubbard, but his eyes were serious. "This means everything we're doing is futile, and could even harm the soldiers." "Understand," Hubbard agreed. "Incorrect training would create an ingrained habit in the troops, and if they fought based on that habit on the battlefield, they would inevitably pay the price of blood and lives." Pershing gazed thoughtfully at the dock that came into view. "Right now, the most important thing is learning, not training, recruiting, or anything else." After a moment of silence, Hubbard suddenly remembered something. "There's someone who might be helpful, General. His name is Johnson. He works at the military's tank lab. He bought Share A1 tanks from the Shire and is studying tactics." Pershing's eyes lit up. "Bring him here, I might need him. Also, buy the equipment that Bernard Company is producing in the U.S." "Which one, General?" Hubbard asked. "How much?" Pershing looked at Hubbard incredulously. If it weren't for their years of collaboration, Pershing would have kicked him out of the car for that one sentence. The U.S. military was expanding from 300,000 to 1 million, and in the near future, it might even reach 2 million or 5 million. Everything was in dire need, especially weaponry. And Hubbard, the guy in charge of daily organization and logistics coordination, actually asked which one, and how many to buy. America had been at peace for too long and had no concept of war, and Hubbard was no exception. At the France Belgrade training base in western Tibet, Charles was enjoying his lunch, a Lorraine savory pie. The picture above shows a Lorraine savory pie, a specialty of Lorraine. Charles didn't think much of it. It was basically just bread with ham, salmon, onions, and the like. Western food is pretty much the same all the time. Bread with meat is a hamburger, bread with cheese is a pizza, and bread with fillings is a pie. But compared to battlefield rations, it was still quite delicious. "What day is it today?" Charles asked, gesturing with his chin towards the ham pie. "I remember Bizinxi isn't part of Lorraine, but it has Lorraine specialties." Tidjany put down his knife and fork, making a blowing out of candles gesture. "June 12th, General, happy birthday." Charles was taken aback, replying, "Thank you, Major General." No need to thank me." Tidjany turned his attention back to the food, shrugging. I strictly follow your orders. There are no birthdays on the battlefield. This was prepared for you by Mr. Victor. He found out your birthday, Victor. Charles didn't recall knowing such a person. Tigeny explained, he has a factory in Metz, and he led a workers' uprising when we stormed Metz. When the British were defeated, he was afraid of being purged by the Germans, so he fled here. I think he wanted to use this campaign to remind you not to forget Lorraine. Charles smiled slightly. This was a hope that he would lead his troops back to liberate Lorraine, especially Metz. Why didn't he flee with the British? Charles asked. Obviously, Tigeny answered vaguely. They think it's safer to escape here, and they believe you can lead them to reclaim what's theirs. Many others besides him think the same way. Charles shook his head slightly. He was afraid he would disappoint them. This land was what Charles intended to use to weaken the British and German forces. Just then, a messenger brought Charles a telegram from Joka. Happy birthday, my child. Good news. The U.S. government bought all of Joseph's inventory and production capacity at a high price. We made over $600 million, and this is just the first batch. Your decision was very successful. We even sold helmets at a high price. Setting up a factory in the U.S. was very wise and far-sighted. This had worked as a warning to the U.S. Charles was satisfied. He now had funds to continue acquiring quality assets in France. Good news? Tigeny asked. Yes, Charles replied. America is preparing to enter the war. Tigeny's knife clattered onto the plate. You mean it? Of course it's true, Charles said. Surprised, Tigeny shook his head slightly, his face grim. Not surprised, but the war is going to continue. Tigeny accepted the fact Charles had told him earlier. This war was one the capitalists didn't want to end. Therefore, he knew that America's entry into the war wasn't to stop the war itself, but to prevent negotiations and a ceasefire. Charles continued eating his savory pie. Although he had proposed negotiations and a ceasefire, he had never truly intended for them to materialize. Charles's goal, from beginning to end, was to force America into the war. This included the declassified Zimmerman telegram sent to America. End of this chapter. Thank you so much for reading until the end. Don't forget to give it a like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription or donation encourages us to continue. Thank you all. See you in the next video.